Welcome back to the channel. This is Freddy Storm and you are watching second and final part of What If Naruto became most wanted assassin. If you enjoyed this video, please like, share and subscribe to this channel. Now wasting no time, let's start the story.
The only person to express an opinion was Takeshi, who said, "Not bad, you could almost pass as one of us." I do not take that as a compliment, I laughed at him. Ronin snarled as he stood in front of the open window. "Enough, let's get out of here." He waited for him to return. Leaning against a table with his arms and feet crossed, "Ah, Zetsu, you certainly took your time in returning," the man said. Zetsu had just begun to phase through the cave's floor, which they had designated as their base of operations. He no longer wondered how the man in front of him could sense his approach. He moved deeper into the room. Lowering his head in a respectful nod toward the man in the orange mask with the swirl on it, he reported his findings while looking into the only red eye that the mask had exposed. As he listened to the information his subordinate had learned about their target, Tobi seemed to stand motionless. "Very good. Zetsu, where is Ronin now?" "Suna," Zetsu's white half answered. "Interesting, so he intends to protect the Hyuga?" "It would appear so, though the motive behind such action is suspicious. He has cared little for human life other than his partner. Why would he care about the female?" The black part of Zetsu replied. "I have my suspicions. What of your other task? Have you learned anything on the whereabouts of the Jinchuriki?" Tobi said with a menacing smile behind his mask. Zetsu's white half cleared his throat nervously and said, "No, I have not. His disappearance was flawlessly executed, as even I cannot find him." Zetsu was taken aback when Tobi let out a low laugh. Zetsu's black half immediately realized this, cocking his head slightly to the side. "You believe Ronin is the Jinchuriki, don't you?" Tobi chuckled at Zetsu. "Very good, you finally caught on. I wondered how long it would take you. Yes, I have my suspicions that he has merely taken on the identity of Ronin." "What makes you so suspicious?" asked Zetsu's black half. Tobi's gaze widened as his voice grew. Let's see, Naruto Uzumaki disappeared from his village at the age of 13. Then we begin to hear rumblings of a masked assassin of young age with blonde hair and blue eyes. This assassin appears to be near the age the Jinchuriki would be, not to mention the fact that all of his jutsus possess a power unlike any other. Let's not forget the fact that all of his targets have been either A or S ranked and none have escaped him, a feat one shouldn't bat an eye at. "Do you believe Konoha created the identity of Ronin to keep him hidden while still getting missions completed?" "That I cannot say, though it would be a bold move on the part of Tsunade, would it not? If that is not the case, then the reasons for the identity shift are rather confusing." "But why? Why would he run from his village only to create a more renowned identity for himself?" White Zetsu asked, still perplexed. Tobi sighed. "It matters not to me. We need to determine if my suspicions are accurate. You will return and continue to watch him. And if he is not the Jinchuriki, then we recruit him. Either way is advantageous to our goals. If he is not the Jinchuriki, then we will put him to use in locating the one we seek, as well as the others." Zetsu nodded and followed Tobi's instructions, pacing the floor. "Very well." Tobi stood there thinking about what might happen if Ronin was the nine-tailed beast's missing host, and if he wasn't. In any case, arrangements would have to be made to handle the man. Maybe after all, the Hyuga would be useful. When Hanabi turned a corner and collided with someone, she was in a hurry to find her father. She instinctively retreated into a fighting stance and grasped the handle of a kitchen knife she had purchased by slipping her hand into her sleeve. When she discovered that the person she had run into was Hinata's fiancé, she stopped her attack. She decided not to waste time mincing words, letting go of the knife and straightening to stand. He flashed a look of surprise and then something she couldn't quite put her finger on, but she decided to ignore them. "Nezu, where is my father? I think I know where Hinata is." "Hanabi-san, we thought the worst. Are you all right?" His expression finally appeared to have settled on the typical distance she had grown accustomed to. "There is no time. Where is my father?" he asked, dismissing his worry. She began to pass him without observing the clenching of his jaw or the hateful flash in his eyes. "Yes, of course, time is of the essence. Last I saw him he was in the suite you shared with Hinata-chan." Hanabi nodded sharply and hurried off to the suite in another wing of the inn. She slowed to a fast walk as soon as she heard her father's sweet voices talking to Neji. Moving as quickly as she could, she saw him standing outside the Hyuga clan's meeting room. She's eyes widened in surprise as he turned to see his youngest daughter running toward him. In an attempt to reassure himself that she was okay, he went up to her. He took hold of both her forearms and insisted that she tell him everything that had happened. Hanabi condensed everything to the most crucial details, so recounting the events didn't take long. The ones she deemed most significant, anyway. Hiyashi had to inform his youngest daughter of the real circumstances. She obviously didn't know everything and thought Ronin was an enemy. He beckoned her to his suite and said, "Come," so he could give her the information she was missing. Oto-san, did you not hear me? Hanabi said, jerking away from her father. A bewildered Hanabi was left standing in the hallway, her mouth hanging open, as Hiyashi shook his head and said, "There is more to this than you know, Masumi." He then proceeded to his suite. She was baffled by his apparent lack of concern. What more important thing could he tell me than finding Hinata immediately? Then Hanabi made a decision. She growled, "No," and then spun around on her heel, hurrying back to the room she had marked. Hiyashi turned, stunned by his daughter's strong denial. "Follow her," he told his nephew, doing the only thing he could think of as she ran off. In an attempt to help his cousin in any way he could, he hurried behind her. Neji felt uneasy about the turn of events. Even though he knew Ronin meant no harm to Hinata if she were directly protected by him, he would feel better and stay by her side. "I won't leave either of them," he thought as he watched Hanabi turn a corner. He saw Hanabi stop suddenly in front of one of the North Wing's suite doors. So near. We have men searching the entire village because they had been so close. 5 minutes prior, as Naruto's eyes passed over her, he was saddened to see that the light blue eyes had taken the place of the ones with a faint lavender tint. He clenched his stomach at the sight of her in the all-black attire. The memory of the glimpses of her nude body he had caught at the stream and while dressing her shoulder made him feel harder. Even though her entire body was covered by the outfit, it didn't stop his body from reacting. He was even more tempted to watch her remove each layer as a result. He shook his head, forcing himself to concentrate on the goal, and then he turned away entirely to shut the suite's still open door. He walked over to the window at the other end of the sitting room and observed how she positioned herself so that Takeshi and he were both inside her sphere. The corner of his mouth quirked as he wanted to grin proudly at the training that was obviously ingrained in her. He instantly repressed the desire. As expected, Takeshi expressed his opinion, saying, "Not bad, you could almost pass as one of us." Naruto knew they were running out of time before it caught up to him because he could hear the fatigue in his friend's voice. Before everything went to shit around them, they had to move quickly. He heard Hinata laugh at Takeshi, just out of the corner of his eye. "I do not take that as a compliment," he snarled. "Enough, let's get out of here," cutting off the response he knew his friend would offer. He stood in front of the open window and motioned for them to exit it before him. When Hinata came first, he stopped her with his hand. He nodded, signaling that he wanted a tired Takeshi to go out first to look around, and he saw her nod, her eyes open after closing them for a moment. Fortunately, they were on ground level when Takeshi lumbered out the window and proceeded to scout ahead. Naruto motioned for Hinata to follow. After waiting for the all-clear hand signal, he was taken aback by her newfound silence, but now he had to acknowledge that everything about her caught him off guard. It was as if he was standing on uneven ground, unable to find a firm footing in her company. As he watched her pass through the window, he crouched down outside and used her Byakugan to look around for other people. For not asking her for that before he threw Takeshi out the window, he felt compelled to slap his forehead. She would be unable to see their chakra signatures due to the seals applied to each of them, but she would be able to tell if anyone other than her sister was coming. He had forgotten to take into account her skills because he was so accustomed to depending solely on his and Takeshi's. Before attempting to catch up to Takeshi, she let go of her Kekkei Genkai and gave him a nod of approval. She acted as though we were a team and had no qualms about cooperating. He forced himself to wake up and looked around the room to make sure they had left no evidence of their presence. He discovered her discarded clothes, neatly folded, resting on the counter after entering the bedroom and then the bathroom. He scooped them up and shoved them into his pack before returning to the sitting room window, leaping out of it with agility. He soon overtook the other two and assumed the lead. He knew he had to send a message covering his ass for where they were going. After taking a quick look to his left, in the suite, Hinata had experienced an argumentative feeling that was unfamiliar to her. Not one I let loose. Anyway, she was surprised that she had defended herself in this manner. It was nothing new for her to argue with herself, but to express them out loud normally, she would not have been able to express such thoughts because she had been taught manners and decorum for so many years. Given the current circumstances, it seemed as though all of those years were being swept away. She had become quiet after realizing that her sarcastic demeanor was not helping the situation. Despite how difficult it might be, she had to cooperate with these two men and have faith in them. She had to admit that she had been a little offended that he hadn't asked her to scout the area, but she ignored it and went ahead and did so in order to direct her chakra toward using her eyes. She let go of the hinge covering them. His eyes widened in satisfaction as he realized what she was doing. In a quiet voice, she had informed him that she could be useful in this effort to stay under the radar. She was shocked to see how close the spherical structure housing the case cage was to her left. As they fled the Hoshi Inn, the case cage tower was in the middle of the village, so it was not difficult to reach any part of it. However, she pointed out that they did seem to be moving toward it. She was aware that her father would soon be pestering Gara-sama to help find her. She regretted that she was unable to somehow ease their anxiety and distress. To move through the village, They creep around buildings and hide in the shadows. She signaled to them with her eyes when it was safe to move as they approached the tower to her. The henge would have to stay unutilized. Fortunately, since they were traveling in the complete darkness of the night, it wouldn't matter. In addition to the fact that they took care to avoid people on their trek, it would be extremely difficult for anyone to notice her eyes. Before long, Ronin motioned for them to wait against a house's wall as he sprinted ahead. Out of sight as they waited, she saw Takeshi tilt his head back, close his eyes, and lean on the wall for support. He was breathing heavily, taking the rear guard position. He had been trailing behind her and Ronin. It was obvious that her sister's attempt to flee had taken a toll on him. Hinata reluctantly felt sorry for him, wondering if he would be okay. When Ronin returned with his eyes squinted in alarm at the sight of his partner, she was startled out of her reverie. He grabbed Takeshi by the waist and threw one of his arms over his shoulders, letting his partner rest on him. The fact that Takeshi didn't argue with Ronin surprised Hinata, indicating that he wasn't feeling well. That must be what happens to someone who gets their ass handed to them via electric shock. Ronin led the way around to the back of a big house and motioned for them to go through the big wall that stood in front of them. She followed. She instantly stopped and gave him a look of clear bewilderment. He tapped his temple close to his right eye in silence. She turned on the Byakugan and took another look at the wall. She recognized the wall as an optical illusion and smiled beneath her own mask. She was facing an opening in the outer wall, which was one of two walls in front of her. Those in the know could just walk through the outer wall and continue by going left or right along the inner wall, while the average observer would assume it was sturdy due to the way it was constructed. It was utterly brilliant. After nodding and turning her head slightly in Ronin's direction, she watched as his hand motioned for her to move to the right as soon as she was through the opening. Before she found herself in an open yard inside the walls, Hinata was impressed by the amount of thought that went into creating the entrance that was hidden in plain sight. She had assumed that it was set up in what would be considered desert landscaping. There was a big circle of compacted sand in the middle of the yard. The remainder of the yard was made up of loose gravel and desert-dwelling plants, such as cacti. She turned when she heard a grunt and saw that Ronin had lifted Takeshi across his shoulders, leaving him fully unconscious. She took a step forward and held up her left hand in a gesture of help, preferring to keep quiet until he gave the all-clear to speak. Naruto rejected her help with a shake of his head. It hadn't been as hard as he thought to get here, walking through the village. She had remained quiet and had helped instead of impeding. Even though he had taken the lead, he had closely monitored her and Takeshi. Since she'd stopped playing the part of a Konoha shinobi, he'd noticed that she wasn't lacking in speed or flexibility. Naturally, he also noticed the proof of her grace, which she had always had. She seemed to have it in her nature, which added to her gentle appearance. A wave of protectiveness washed over him as he recalled the timid and kind Hinata. However, the thought of the self-assured, attractive woman she had grown into evoked some inexplicable emotions, including a good deal of desire. He motioned for her to follow him inside, stopping his thoughts before they became distracting, as he always did these days. They went through a back door and entered a spacious sitting area that appeared to be used as a study. Hinata was amazed by the house's interior. The sitting room exuded luxury and comfort in every way. There were a number of big couches with thick, comfortable cushions. The thick carpeting in the middle of the room, where the couches were, seemingly mirrored the desert garden, as she had called it, with the exception of a bar. The rest of the space had dark hardwood floors that blended in perfectly with the kitchen. When she had finished admiring the room, she jumped a little when she realized that Ronin had silently left it while carrying Takeshi. She tried to find him by moving around the room, and she came to a hallway. As he was leaving a bedroom, he closed the door and stopped in the hall, raising his hands to rub his face, but he didn't see her. Hinata watched in horror as the heels of his hands pushed the mask down beneath his jaw. Her pulse quickened, and she had the impression that she was perched on a precipice, waiting for the smallest movement to send her plummeting to the ground. With his hands still on his face, he suddenly tensed up and turned his head slightly, noticing her presence with his spread fingers. He disappeared and was replaced by a tiny puff of smoke before she could say anything to prevent me from seeing his face. He employed a shunshin. Her heart had completely stopped before attempting to explode from her chest at the mere thought of seeing the face behind the mask, so she took a slow breath in an attempt to slow it down. She turned to return to the sitting room, her shoulders sagging. Naruto strode into the kitchen to get them something to eat while mentally scolding himself for the near miss. It's unbelievable that I almost let her see my face. Why in the world was I thinking this? Still, he was aware that he had not been thinking. Takeshi would have made one of his infrequently perceptive remarks if he had been conscious, suggesting that maybe Naruto did, in fact, want her to know who he was while he was gathering ingredients. He stopped to consider whether that was really the case. He became irate because he knew that even if he wanted it, it was impossible. As Ronin, he was a wanted assassin in every village with a large bounty on his head, and as Naruto, He was a missing nin that his village was looking for. She won't benefit from approaching me in either identity. He felt angry and hopeless at the idea that Hinata would never know who he was behind the mask. He shook his head as he saw Hinata come into the kitchen, looking agitated. As Hinata walked into the kitchen, she could feel the flush rising in her cheeks. She couldn't believe she felt that way and was ashamed of her response to the prospect of seeing his face. I'm still wearing the mask. Thank you, Kami, perhaps I'll keep it. She had to confess that she was amazed that the mere thought of seeing him could cause her to blush or experience such an emotion. Naruto was the only person who had ever forced her to react in this manner, and nobody knew his whereabouts or whether he was still alive. These emotions differed from those she had experienced when she was just 13 years old. No, those emotions had resembled a soft flutter of butterflies in her abdomen. She experienced a raging pounding of her heart and a heated clenching of her stomach. The realization that these new sensations were a sense of desire that accompanied her age-related maturity made her flush even more. Even during the 8 years that Naruto had been missing, she had never expressed interest in anyone but him. Now she wondered why a stranger in a mask was causing such a reaction. She found it troubling because she had thought that as she had grown older, her crush on Naruto had grown stronger. She now questioned whether those feelings were genuine, given that a stranger could evoke something more powerful. As she walked into the kitchen, she heard him sigh in frustration, which instantly made her angry. For what reason must he be annoyed? I didn't ask him to keep me safe, and I most definitely didn't ask to be put in this situation. Hinata sat down on a stool at the bar, her anger storing her defenses. She saw that he had taken off his jacket and was now dressed in a black sleeveless shirt that appeared to be tailored to his upper body. She became irate for enjoying the well-defined view of his broad shoulders that tapered down to a muscular torso, which did not improve her mood. She took a deep breath and tried to be the peacekeeper that her teammates had always made fun of her for. She felt it was safe to talk about the food he had taken out of the refrigerator. You're going to cook? It was clear that he was going to cook, so it wasn't her smartest attempt at conversation. She wanted to give herself a mental slap. He looked up into those icy blue eyes of hers as he started chopping vegetables. His retort was abrupt and left little opportunity for additional discussion. Even an assassin has to eat. She wished a magic button existed that would restore the casual banter they had started at the inn. She tried again and inquired about his partner. So how is your friend? Did Hanabi really do that much damage in her escape attempt? He stopped in the middle of slicing a head of lettuce and looked at her with emotionless, flat eyes. Thanks to rescuing you the first time, and all the traveling we've done to rescue you again, he hasn't slept in nearly 48 hours. I'd say he deserves a nap, wouldn't you? Naruto refused to acknowledge that the lengthy sparring match he had made Takeshi participate in was partly to blame for his lack of sleep. He was aware that his friend was very resilient and could work hard to stay up with him. Takeshi, however, was not a Jinchuriki and had a limited lifespan before his body shut down. The young Hyuga's attempt to flee was obviously the final straw that caused his body to give out from exhaustion. She said, "Fine." He looked up to see Hinata yanking herself off the stool, which slid backwards and scraped the hardwood floor. He would explain any damage to this house, and he barely suppressed a wince. Before she had stood, her voice had been filled with frustration and rage. She didn't stomp through the living room, which surprised him. Instead, she seemed to enter the yard through the back door with poise and composure. His jaw tightened as he struggled to maintain a detached distance from her and to apologize for his actions. He never doubted his choice to become Ronin or leave the village, and now he found himself wishing that things had gone differently. This fact only served to increase his level of frustration. An hour later, Gaara was on her way out of the Hoshi Inn following a meeting with the Hyuga clan chief. Given the situation, it hadn't been a pleasant one. He started to wonder if his suggestion that Hiashi hire Ronin to save Hinata the first time had been the right one. He had been thinking about the coldness he had started to notice in his friend's eyes at that time. Over the years, he had seen Naruto transform into an emotionless shade and genuinely become Ronin. Gaara had been concerned, wondering what he could do to help his friend. He was reminded of the Chunin exams when he found out that Hinata Hyuga had been kidnapped. Her fight with her cousin Neji and the impact it had on Naruto were particularly noticeable. He pondered whether the young lady could influence his friend once more. Tamari would have accused him of matchmaking if she were aware of his tactics, but he denied it. All I wanted was for my friend to survive. The fact that Naruto had granted the initial request to save Hinata had pleased him. It had caused him to question whether, in spite of his seeming success in erasing such ties, his friend still felt a bond with his erstwhile comrade. He was now concerned about the trouble he had dragged his friend into because of the Hyuga heiress. Hiashi had apologized for causing such trouble in Gaara's village. Rather than asking for his help in locating Ronin, Gaara had felt compelled to assure the Hyuga patriarch that Suna would, of course, provide any assistance necessary to put an end to the situation, and that it was not his fault. Neji Hyuga and Hanabi had both kept quiet throughout the meeting, despite the younger Hyuga's obvious desire to voice her thoughts. To learn more about the situation, he needed to talk to Naruto. He was aware that they had left the room he kept for him. The Hyugas had disclosed this to him when they briefed him on the latest developments. It seems that Hanabi Hyuga was the one who found the room he had set aside and provided for Naruto. She and Neji searched the room thoroughly, but they were unable to find any clues as to who had been there or where they might have gone. An open window was the only indication that someone had been in the room, but any potential footprints in the sand were washed away by Suna's powerful winds. As Hiyashi and his daughter had argued over how to proceed with her protection, he had made an effort to be patient. The girls' return to Konoha with a Hyuga detail was finally ordered by Hiyashi in order to escort them across the border. Gaara had then offered to send his own brother and sister along with the detail. Hiyashi had obviously been hesitant to accept the offer, but he ultimately gave in out of a desire to ensure his daughter's safety. He was speculating about Naruto's next move when Hinata's wedding was imminent. He would not take her far from her family or her fiancé. Gaara was also frustrated by that. He found it incomprehensible that the Hyuga elders would insist on the marriage at such a distressing moment. Why do they think that after she gets married, the threat will go away? It's illogical. When Gaara first met Hinata's future husband, he got the feeling that he was a cold, calculating man who wanted to elevate himself by using the Hyuga name since he preferred to be as quiet and unobtrusive as possible. The others didn't seem to notice him and frequently forgot he was there. It goes without saying that Nezu Damasu had not impressed Gaara. Kankuro joined his party as soon as he left the inn. "There's a message waiting for you at the tower," his brother told him, tired of listening ears. Gaara could tell from the brief silence that Naruto was most likely the sender of the message. He acknowledged with a nod and rushed to the tower. He checked to make sure no one was following him before going inside his office. He was certain that the figure in the shadows was one of Naruto's Kage Bunshin. Gaara said, "You're risking a lot contacting me this way," as he walked across the room to his desk. "I thought it necessary at the time." Gaara gave a nod. "I've just returned from the Hoshi Inn. I'm sorry you've lost your room for the time being." Naruto winced as he slid his mask down to his neck and said, "Yeah, that sucks." Gaara smirked at him as she sat down, saying, "So the young Hyuga managed to catch Takeshi off guard. I'll not be forgetting that anytime soon." With a hint of humor on his face, Naruto said, "Neither will I." "Yes, you'll have to give him hell about it for me as he doesn't even know I'm your contact here." Naruto just gave a nod. "So, I assume you were here to tell me you transported Hinata Hyuga to the house. I wanted to make you aware I know you primarily reside here, but I didn't want there to be any surprises if you decided to rest there instead," said Naruto's Kage Bunshin, nodding again. "Thanks for the warning, Naruto. Tell me about your plans." With a shrug, the Kage Bunshin said, "The only thing left to do is to protect the Hyuga, at least until Takeshi gets better." "Recovers?" Gaara asked, raising an eyebrow beneath the recognizable symbol for love. This self-deprecating expression on Naruto's face read, "I may have pushed him to go without sleep for over 2 days, with a 16-hour spar thrown in there somewhere. From what you've told me, he is good at keeping up, but even you should know better than that," Gaara said with a chuckle. "Yes, I am aware he met with Hiyashi on his own. When he gets up, I'll decide what to do next." Gaara nodded and said, "Is there anything else? What did your encounter at the inn teach you?" Gaara leaned back in his chair and pursed his lips. "Hiyashi is concerned but believes in you. His youngest daughter believes that Takeshi and you pose the greatest danger to her sister Temari, and Kankuro will be part of her full escort as she returns to Konoha. And Hinata's fiancé isn't to be trusted," Gaara said, pausing for a breath while drumming his fingers on his desktop. "Neji has suspicions but is following the orders of the clan head." Naruto squinted at his friend's face and asked, "Why do you say that?" "A feeling I have." Once again, Naruto nodded, implicitly trusting his friend's judgment. "I'll let him know." He then scattered, causing memories of this exchange to flood Naruto's mind. A decade prior, Naruto had surreptitiously watched as Hinata entered the yard and started practicing the fighting stances of her family's gentle fist technique. He remembered that fateful morning when he had attempted to spy on her training, but this time she practiced in the pale light of a sliver moon, dressed entirely in black, with her hair pulled up and the black mask covering most of her face. He forced himself to look away from her and continued to finish a light dinner, more rice balls, knowing that Takeshi loved them and that this was his way of saying he was sorry for pushing him past his breaking his limits. After finishing the meal, he supported himself before going outside into the yard. "The food is ready." With a slight pant from her workout, Hinata replied, "Thank you, but I'm not hungry." When she spoke again, Naruto stopped on his way back into the house, knowing that she was being disrespectful, and he decided to honor her unspoken request to be left alone. "So, what is the strategy?" Returning his attention to her, he said, "I don't have one." Do you really think he'll believe that? She asked him doubtfully as she stood in the center of the yard. With a casual shrug, he answered, I don't really care what you think. There isn't a plan until my partner wakes up and tells me what he discovered after talking to your father. Remember that I have no more explanations to give you. All you need to know is that it is my responsibility to keep you alive. The asshole act again? Her tone was one of contempt. What action? Hinata shook her head in disgust, waiting for him to say something more. She couldn't understand his fluctuating moods. He had been friendly and playful in the sweets kitchenette, even laughing at his attack on his friend, but now he was treating her with what she would almost describe as contempt. Given your obvious lack of concern for me, why will you attempt to keep me alive? What could an assassin possibly do? The cash, of course. So what? You'll simply keep me here for an indeterminate amount of time without any clear plan that seems to be working out nicely. He cocked his head to the side and asked, What's wrong, Hyuga? Are you afraid you won't make it to your wedding? I guarantee that you will be blissfully married in 5, oh no, let's say 4 days. Hinata clenched her jaw and felt ice form in her veins at the thought of her impending nuptials, but he stormed into the house before she could control her rage long enough to respond. Naruto was shocked to find Takeshi standing in the center of the living room, his eyes blazing. When he returned home, You're wrong for that, you know. He tried to brush past his friend, not wanting to hear what he had to say, but was stopped by a firm hold on his arm. She doesn't deserve you treating her as though something crawled up your ass. He felt his rage building and jerked his arm away from Takeshi, saying, I didn't ask for your opinion. In any case, you will receive it. Think of it as one of the advantages of having me as a friend. I should have killed you 5 years ago when I found you. Yeah, like I've never heard that before. Naruto entered the kitchen, leaned against the counter, and pointed to the prepared food, which Takeshi disregarded. After wiping his face, Takeshi asked, How long have I been out? Naruto shrugged and said, Almost an hour. Well, listen, damn it, Hiashi isn't overly happy about his daughter becoming missing. However, he has decided to join the program. An intriguing fact for you is that Nezu, the fiancé you assured her she would have a happy marriage with, met with Jun in secret. With a deadly gaze, Naruto's eyes narrowed. Did you hear what was said? No, I couldn't have snuck in from my position because they were in one of the inn's gardens. Jun was clearly attempting to appease Nezu, who was unhappy about whatever they were talking about. With a hand raised to massage his chin through the mask, Naruto said, Well, then I guess our next move is to find out what they were discussing. Takeshi had witnessed Naruto's shadow clone dissipating so many times that he knew to wait until all the memories had passed through his friend's mind before speaking, and Naruto's body gave a barely noticeable jerk. Well, that was interesting. Takeshi simply raised an eyebrow in interest while he awaited Naruto to elaborate on that remark. Apparently, my contact here in Suna suspects the fiancé as well. So an interrogation with some maiming and torture are in our foreseeable future, huh? Takeshi said, concisely summarizing both of their opinions. As his consciousness began to regain control of his thoughts, darkness began to fade into light. His body ached as though it had been in a painful, immobile position for a long time, and his head was pounding. A tremendous amount of fear swept over his body as light flickered through his eyelids, causing him to stir slightly. This was incorrect. He was not supposed to be sleeping. It was as though he was dreaming. Recalling images of recent events, he was traveling through the village in search of supplies when he recently met Nezu before he could rest after the long night of events. He also had a meeting with the shadowy Akatsuki figure he last remembered, making his way from one building after bartering a deal that would aid the Hyuga heiress's plot, and then nothing. He realized he was immobile due to an involuntary muscle reaction, and his fear quickly escalated into total panic. Sweat began to trickle down his brow as his eyes finally opened, trying to take in everything in the hopes that the sensations in his bones were not real. Being in a well-lit room almost made him feel better, but then he realized what he was doing. He appeared to be strapped to the chair in which he sat. The most unsettling aspect, however, was that his wants were tied at the wrist and pulled taut in front of him, while his torso was stretched across a stone table. As was customary in Suna, it looked as though the ropes were fastened beneath the table, making it impossible to move. Despite having served as an informant for a number of dubious organizations over the years, what he heard and witnessed next made this specific incident even more damning in his memory. From behind and to his left, there was a faint shuffling sound. He craned his neck as far as he could in that direction to try to see who the potential interrogator might be. The chill of death ran down his spine when he realized who it was that was coming. A face of death was superimposed on his own image of the person who would take his soul from his flesh. Death was wearing a mask that covered his face from the neck to the bridge of his nose and most of his cheeks, and he could see it now. He was certain that if the mask were taken off, a set of razor-sharp teeth would be embedded in a sunken, bony jaw that was foul-smelling from the flesh of people he thought it had eaten. It made sense to dress in black because the midnight attire would make it difficult to look away from the disarming blue eyes that had taken up residence in their sockets. These were long dead, a testament to the death and horrors he witnessed in hell. But normally he found blue eyes to be warm and frequently welcoming as he enjoyed the cries of agony he caused to others. There were even occasional flashes of red in them. He had bright blonde hair on top of his head, but as he felt the heat of the demon's stare, he saw a picture of a yellow fire. He could swear he heard a growl before he could make out any words as Death spoke in a deep tone as he got closer. "Jun, I think we need to have a little talk again." Ronan made sure he hit nothing vital by driving a kunai into his thigh on the outside of his femur just as he got to the left of the chair Jun was seated in, as his throat was already strained by his windless lungs. There was a loud scream of pain that was accompanied by tearful sobs. He moved to the other side of the table and pushed on the rope that was fastened to his right wrist and dangling from the end of the table. As the scream died down, Jun's face was etched with a great deal of strain as a result. "That was just for being the weasel that you were. You know how I detest those that sell their soul to the highest bidder, causing human atrocities to occur for the simple sake of a few extra ryo." He stumbled. Ronan. WWHY. For answers really you contact me through the usual channels to get me to take a job at the request of the cage to retrieve that girl, Naruto said. Then you have the audacity to request me for a mission to act as a third-party contributor to rip the eyes out of her skull just after I retrieved her. I don't play second string in contract work. You know that. What was the ulterior motive for requesting me for such a thing? To his astonishment, Jun was unaware that the retrieval contract was originally created by the cage. If Ronan was specifically asked for that job, that would be important information to know naturally, that would rely on whether he survived this or not. I don't know what you mean. The contract came from a person who accepted the original from Kumo. I believe that he thought he wasn't strong enough to do it himself, and no other would make an attempt considering her guard's presence. As he applied more pressure to the rope and observed his arm muscles straining under the increased pressure, he asked, "You wouldn't be lying to me, would you, Jun?" Having your muscles gradually torn apart hurt, although the pain from the displacement would quickly go away when a joint popped out of its socket. The gradual tearing of the muscle fibers caused a persistent ache. He gritted his teeth and answered, "No, I would never." Tears began to trickle down his cheeks and blend with the perspiration on his brow. Naruto said, "Then tell me, who was the person that brought the contract for the eyes to you?" As though he were lounging in the sun rather than hearing his victim's gasping cries. He pressed his forehead against the table and breathed, "You know I can't tell you that my clients would abandon me if I released even one name." Screams that had not been heard before suddenly filled the room. Then they heard a thump and a squishing sound, and when Jun tried to look up, blood splattered across his face. Naruto had struck two of Jun's fingers with his fist. They were probably smashed into more pieces than one could count in a matter of hours, so there wasn't even the sound of bones breaking. They exploded in a spray as the skin burst and the pressure suddenly increased. After a moment of sobbing he continued, "I would worry more about whether you were going to make it out of this alive, although, as much as you have pissed me off, you may want to plead for a quick death after you've told me what I want to know." Jun was unable to determine whether his tears were brought on by the agony or the fear of death. He still harbored a faint hope that he would survive, but he would have to forfeit some knowledge and hope that no one would recognize him. It was Nezu. Nezu approached me with the contract. Naruto was not surprised by this. After what Takeshi had told him, he had anticipated it. Why involve me though? He could have easily taken the eyes from her when they slept after their marriage. There is more you're not telling me. Jun exclaimed, "No, I swear that is all I know." Naruto quickly and forcefully pushed the rope that secured the hand's shattered and bleeding fingers to the wrist. 3 pops could be heard as the wrist, elbow, and shoulder joints came out of their sockets. "Don't take me for a fool, you filthy vermin. You always know more than you let on. The truth now, or this will get painful, well, more painful." Although Jun wasn't certain that things could get worse than they were right now, he didn't want to find out if at all possible. Okay, Nezu requested you specifically," he gasped. "After you saved the girl from the hired kidnappers, he wanted to cash in the bounty on your head in the bingo book as well. He was going to sell her to Kumo after he captured and killed you. You were worth a small fortune in rewards, more than the unsealed eyes of a Byakugan user. You know this does not help our relationship, Jun." Naruto smirked beneath the mask, "and you were going to go along with this to make yourself rich at the expense of my life. This would be the reason behind the attack at the hotel?" With his chin frequently resting on the table, he nodded as best he could and said, "Yes. He was hoping the father would hire you again to retrieve her just like last time. Then he would ambush you with a large force when you went to her rescue. He released the rope as a small reward. pleased that his captive's tongue was a bit more flexible, since that has obviously failed. What is his next plan to capture the mighty Ronin? Adding a few sobs in the hopes that it would be convincing, she said, I don't know, I haven't seen him since he asked me to gather a few men to kidnap her from the hotel. Once again, there were screams as Naruto pushed a kunai into Jun's other arm, close to the shoulder, until the bone stopped it then. In order to intensify the unnerving pain beyond simply slicing through muscle and tissue, he dragged it down, making sure the metal scraped the bone. You're lying again, Jun. My partner saw you in the garden of the inn with Nezu, said. Nezu appeared adamant about you helping him with his next attempt. What is the plan again? Things can get much worse than this. He screamed. He is planning another attempt at the wedding. As soon as the sensation of metal scraping his arm bone stopped making his body tremble, he asked me to assemble a large enough force to take you down, knowing that you were hired to protect and deliver her to the ceremony. He concluded that Jun was no longer required after obtaining the knowledge he needed to outmaneuver Nezu. You know I don't like being lied to, Jun, and I don't feel that you have earned neither the right to live nor the right to a quick death. You sold your soul and honor for not even a guarantee of money. When they find you, others will be sure not to make the same mistake. Naruto approached Jun from the right and extended his hand beneath the table. He stabbed Jun in the abdomen with 2 quick motions. I have just pierced your appendix and your spleen. They are currently releasing their fluids into your body and poisoning you. It is not a quick death, and it is rather painful once the poison takes effect, but others will get the message. Don't worry, no one knows you're here, and the room is sealed for sound, although someone will be here in about 2 days to inspect the building, but you'll be dead by then. Then Naruto turned to leave. Jun, tell the Shinigami I said hi, will you? Jun could already feel his abdominal muscles tensing up painfully. He was correct in his initial assessment of Ronin. He was ruthless, icy, and death, although he didn't think things could get any worse after everything that had happened to him. A slow and agonizing death was far worse than anything he could have ever imagined. Ronin, shouted Jun. He kept on hoping Kami would spare him when he heard the retreating footsteps. Stop, end me quickly and I will give you information that I just received, information that threatens you, the people that are after you, he said, his voice filled with anguish and pain. He said, I'm listening. Quickly he shared everything he knew about Ronin from the notorious group, and then he waited and prayed in agonizing silence. The Akatsuki are looking to recruit you. They want you to join them. They are looking for the Jinchurikis and want you to hunt them down. They asked me today to set them up with a means to contact you. They also want someone named Naruto, who is supposed to be your first target. Since it didn't really matter, he wasn't sure if it was minutes or moments. Tears filled his eyes and tremors ran through his body, and then suddenly there was darkness. He closed his eyes and let out a long sigh as he turned away from the now dead body. He was urged to rest by the weight of fatigue tugging at his limbs. He knew that if he gave in, he would be pulled into a deeper sleep than he could afford, even though a part of him argued that it would only be for a few minutes. He left the room where he had tortured his informant, rubbing his hands over his face to try to remove the fatigue. His mental fatigue was only exacerbated by the information he learned during that interrogation session. Jun had been more helpful than Naruto had anticipated and had validated his suspicions. He walked away from the building and the empty shell of a body that had once held Jun, a weasel. He took a deep breath as he stepped out the door, grateful that the wind had subsided and that he wasn't breathing in sand. He was unable to use his senses to look for another person, an amateur error in the world he lived in. He immediately regretted it when he heard the sand shifting behind him. As he turned, he felt the sharp pain of the sword piercing his back and driving it through his right shoulder at a downward angle. Just below his collarbone, he scolded himself for being too slow, realizing that he had overexerted his body and that someone had now caught him off guard. When he looked up after the impact, he saw the face of someone he hadn't seen in years. Sasuke? Upon closer inspection, it was revealed to be his older brother Itachi Uchiha, donning the Akatsuki cloak. Rather than his erstwhile comrade Sasuke, the blade was swiftly twisted before he could even think about attacking, tearing a groan of agony from his throat. Naruto's blue eyes were threatening to exact revenge as he glared up at Itachi. When Itachi said, "Consider this your invitation to join our ranks," he sounded emotionless and bored. The blade was twisted even more sharply in the opposite direction as Naruto clenched his teeth and got ready to move once more. "And if I decline your oh-so-generous proposition?" he said, his voice ripped from his throat by the agony. It was difficult to gauge Itachi or his next move because his face still showed no signs of thought. "That would be impossible. You will either join us as a volunteer or as a subject." The sword then jerked out of Naruto's shoulder, tearing free and scraping bone. Its momentum propelled him forward a little. Itachi's body turned into a flock of ravens that flew in all directions in the 2 seconds it took him to recover and look up. Hinata had been in the yard for 2 hours, moving through katas and old fighting stances, which she felt were stiff. She tried to use physical exertion to release all of her frustrations and anxieties during those 2 hours. She had really only succeeded in wearing herself out as she returned home. She had jokingly observed that Takeshi must have gone to get some more sleep. It was strange because they were supposed to be watching over her and her life was in jeopardy. However, Takeshi had fallen asleep and Ronin had left sarcastically. She thought, some guards. She discovered an empty room where she could rest and clean up after enjoying some of Ronin's onigiri. Unfortunately, she was unable to get the rest she needed because her mind was still replaying the previous few days' events. She had a sneaking suspicion that she had missed something, some small detail that she ought to have noticed but didn't. It was similar to the sensation one gets when they are about to say something but are unable to do so. She threw back the bed's covers in frustration, changed into new clothes, and went into the main sitting room in an attempt to find something to distract her from, well, everything. She started looking at the bindings of the books that were spread out across several shelves that surrounded the room. Naruto entered through the back door and discovered her in this manner. She appeared to be staring at the bookshelves with her back to him. He pondered whether she had finally taken off the mask as her long black hair fell loosely down her back because of all the teeth clenching he had done due to shoulder pain. His jaw was starting to hurt. He had to acknowledge that he felt relieved to be back. All the strength seemed to drain out of him in that moment of relief with Hinata's back as the clear center. His vision started to blur around the edges. She realized she was no longer alone when the hairs on the back of her neck started to stand on end. She spun rapidly and was startled to see Ronin standing close to the door that had already been closed. She was amazed that she had never heard him come back earlier. Takeshi had informed her that Ronin had gone out to do some business, but he had been reticent to reveal what that business might be. She didn't want to know, to be honest. She tried to be courteous by giving him a little smile, but it hardly made it to her eyes. She said, "Welcome back," quietly. All she could get out of him was a quick jerk of his head. She turned back to the books and sighed again, shaking her head. "Where's Takeshi?" She turned back to Ronin and looked at him worriedly. He had sounded as though his teeth were clenched. "He's sleeping." He nodded his head again, and she watched him go into the kitchen. She wondered what it was about him that seemed strange, and she let out a little gasp when she saw that his movements were rigid and unnatural. "He's hurt." She felt her typical shyness take over as she moved to follow him. "Shall I inquire about his well-being? Does he want my help?" She resumed her old practice of wringing her hands. She inhaled deeply and pushed her hands back to her sides. "Are you all right?" In response to her question, she heard a nonverbal sound that sounded like a growl mixed with a grunt. He just stood in the center of the kitchen, staring at the floor as if absorbed in his own thoughts. His dark clothing made it difficult for her to see any injuries. She studied his posture while pursed her lips and came up with a theory. She walked around the kitchen bar and watched him move to keep his right side at an angle away from her. He was making sure she didn't notice, and now she understood why she hadn't been able to detect an injury. She came closer to him even more quickly, shaking her head at his silent act of defiance. After taking a single step, his eyes suddenly met hers, stopping her in her tracks. "Leave me alone, Hyugaheim," he said in a low voice, but she could hear the icy tone in his voice. She was appalled by his attitude and concluded that helping him wasn't worth putting up with his shit. "Okay. Just try not to bleed all over the place. I for one will not be cleaning it up," she said, her eyes narrowing. She spoke in an even tone despite the callousness of what she was saying. She never showed her genuine rage, which she was unable to comprehend or articulate. When questioned, she only knew that having her care for this man dismissed so quickly disturbed her profoundly. On some level it also troubled her, to be honest, that she had been worried at all. Her sole justification was that he had saved her life twice and had treated her with no malice other than asshole tendencies. "I'm annoyed because I have no idea why I care at all. Who am I kidding?" As Hinata turned to exit the kitchen, she noticed Takeshi standing at the entrance to the hallway. He raised an eyebrow in a smirk, but she ignored it and went back to the stack of books in the living room. Reading had always been her passion. For her, as a shy girl, reading was an excellent way to try new things or to act brave like the heroines in her novels. As soon as Naruto came back, Takeshi knew, so he walked quietly over to the sitting room and shamelessly overheard the two in the kitchen. He walked over to Naruto and watched as his friend's eyes followed Hinata's departure. Before he acknowledged him, Naruto took a step in his direction before collapsing as his eyes rolled to the back of his head. Unfortunately, Takeshi was too sluggish to stop him from colliding with the ground. He crouched over him and rolled Naruto onto his back, discovering that his hand was bloody from a big puncture in his shoulder. "Naruto, damn it, what on earth took place?" Behind Takeshi, Hinata ran back to the kitchen at the sound of the impact. The blood on his hand and the hole in Ronin's jacket over his shoulder caught her attention right away. His jacket and undershirt were dark and layered, making it almost impossible to make out any other details. "Damn," said Takeshi, whistling softly. "He is going to be so pissed about that hole in his jacket." Hinata scowled at him, Astonished that his friend was bleeding and worried about the man's potential ire over his ripped jacket a moment later, Hinata was struck by a memory. Takeshi, his jacket is armored, so what could have done this? Observant, aren't you? Yeah, it's armored, so whatever did this was extremely sharp and had a lot of force behind it, Takeshi replied, his face full of seriousness. Takeshi started tugging at Ronan's jacket despite Ronan's attitude. Hinata instantly bent down to assist him because she didn't like to see people suffer. In addition, she experienced a constriction in her abdomen, a sense of concern for the bleeding stranger on the ground. Instead of wasting time trying to cut the jacket off, they had decided to take it off. Cutting the jacket off would be nearly impossible due to the armor in the lining. Furthermore, Takeshi had appeared frightened at the idea of Ronan waking up to discover his priceless jacket even more ruined. But his shirt had been cut away from the wound, exposing what Hinata could only describe as a series of muscle strands. The sight of the wound in his shoulder, which appeared to be a very large hole that went straight through him, nearly destroyed the picture that made people drool. Although her own wound from Goru had been much smaller and in the opposite shoulder, Hinata was reminded of it. She searched for a kitchen towel, rolled it up, and covered the big hole in his chest with it. Then, in an effort to stop the bleeding, she balled up what was left of his shirt to put underneath him. Takeshi looked at the wound, knowing that his friend would be back on his feet soon. If not completely recovered, Naruto would be healed and restored by the Kyuubi. He might, however, benefit from some TLC. As he observed the worry on Hinata's face as she examined the wound, his thoughts became strategic. Do you know how to care for a wound? Takeshi asked Hinata while feigning remorse. Was this man really asking Hinata to play nursemaid? Her eyes widened. What? You don't? There appeared to be a mix of regret, embarrassment, and apology in Takeshi's eyes. Can I pretend or what, man? He pondered. Given that Naruto had spent a lot of time tending to Hinata, Takeshi had determined that tit for tat was justified when he sent him to find her at the stream. Takeshi suspected he had received more than an eyeful. Fair play was what he had in mind, and he was also picturing the laugh he might get from it. No, I don't. He usually doctors his own wounds and he's never had one this bad. I'm hoping Cammy won't hit me for that colossal lie. Hinata was shocked by what was happening, but she didn't have much time to protest that she shouldn't be responsible for someone else's medical treatment. He was bleeding profusely, and the blood was starting to seep through the kitchen towel she had placed over the wound. With a final scowl and a sigh, all right, but I only know a very basic medical jutsu and my first aid skills are even more basic than that. I hope your friend is resilient because I guarantee this treatment alone won't help him. I'll need more towels, whatever you have for bandages and something to clean the wound. Takeshi nodded, trying not to smile, and went to get what she needed. Takeshi had been careful not to take off the mask from Ronan while exposing the wound, and Hinata eyed it. She bit her lower lip, wondering if she ought to look into this man's face. Takeshi clearly believed that she wouldn't, and she detested betraying someone's confidence. Curiosity, however, was a strong incentive for people to do things they shouldn't. She looked around to make sure she was by herself and listened to Takeshi gathering supplies down the hall. She reached for the mask with a trembling hand and a racing heart, fully expecting someone to stop her at any moment. She couldn't resist stroking the cheek that was beneath the mask as soon as her hand touched it. Do I really need to do this? She just had to take off the mask, even for a brief moment. Even though she wasn't sure why she was drawn to this action, her eyes widened as too many emotions flooded through her as she slowly pushed it down until his face was exposed. Takeshi was about to return to the kitchen after gathering everything Hinata had requested when a loud crack broke the stillness of the house. He sprinted back in alarm, but was stopped when he saw Hinata Hyuga glaring at Naruto's bare face, which had a recognizable red handprint. Despite the effects of maturity, Hinata's first reaction upon seeing the characteristic whisker marks and identifying the face that possessed them was one of denial. No, he couldn't possibly not do this. This is not what he would become. As soon as everything seemed to fall into place, including her dreams and feelings, she became angry. Her face flushed because she had started to feel attracted to Ronan when it was Naruto all along. I had been embarrassed by my emotions. The jerk. Her anger seemed to control her thoughts and behavior, rather than letting her blush of embarrassment hold her back as it had in the past. Her hand slammed out and loudly struck his cheek before she realized what she had done. You asshole, Naruto. She snarled. Takeshi was stunned and unsure of how to respond to the situation or what he should do to limit the damage. His best friend was bleeding here, and Hinata Hyuga had learned who he really was. The heiress was radiating so much anger that it was almost like sparks were flying from her. She started muttering angrily as she gave him several light slaps on his arm, shoulder, and face. I can't believe you. I thought you were dead and all this time you've been. She let out a gasp, and you were such a cold bastard to me. Takeshi was just astounded by her outburst of rage at Naruto, but he also thought it was kind of funny. He can't hear you or feel those hits, you know that, right? Sighing in frustration, Hinata said, I know, but it makes me feel better. Maybe this way I won't kill him as soon as he wakes up. She raised her head and glared at Takeshi, who looked both nervous and amused. Oh, relax, I'm not going to cause irreparable damage to him. Yeah, but can I trust you to treat his wound? Takeshi said, his eyes hardening. She was aware that his true concern was whether she could be relied upon to protect his identity. She answered patiently, closing her eyes, yes, you can trust me despite my anger with him. I once held him in high regard. As she held out her hand for the bandages and towels, she said, let's just get him in a bed and patched up so he can rest. The rage and sense of betrayal she was experiencing at the time were beyond words. Even though she kept it well hidden behind her rage, she couldn't help but feel a great sense of relief when she realized that her Naruto-kun was alive. After giving her a suspicious look for a moment, Takeshi appeared to make up his mind. He nodded and handed her all the supplies she would require to tend to Naruto's shoulder. He prayed in private that he wouldn't live to regret this. He also chastised himself for leaving her alone with Naruto and failing to see the alluring mystery that lay before her. When he wakes up, he won't like this. As Naruto Uzumaki lay unconscious in bed, Hinata sat with her arms and legs crossed, her lips pursed, and her gaze fixed on him. She sat there thinking about the situation, his infamous mask clenched tightly in her fist. She had never struck someone out of rage or been so furious at someone. She had to acknowledge that it had been cathartic to hit him for what she perceived to be a long list of bad choices on his part. For example, treating her like shit. Even if he hadn't been conscious, he wouldn't have known she had hit him. When she thought about how he had deceived her, she pictured the smoke pouring out of her nostrils and ears. She had left Naruto's relocation to a bedroom for Takeshi to manage. After giving him the necessary care for his wound, her irate pacing quickly brought her to his bedside, where her feet appeared adamant about staying by his side. Takeshi had lingered nearby for the first hour of her vigil, suspicious of her intentions and possible course of action. She had just sat there and stared at the head of the bed Naruto was lying on. She was aware that he checked on them every few minutes. Even though he had eventually wandered off, she questioned whether this night would ever end because it was starting to feel like the longest one of her life. She wished that this night would end with the approaching dawn, but she would not be able to sleep. After so many years of hearing nothing about Naruto, Hinata had assumed the worst about his fate. She had lamented his absence because she had not been able to find even a scrap of information about him. She had never been so furious as she was now that she knew he was still alive and had developed into such a jerk. She knew, deep down, that he had not felt the same way about her that she had felt about him all those years before. He would obviously be unable to comprehend the extent of her sense of betrayal. She could, however, express to him her displeasure at being duped. Is it possible to accomplish that without expressing your actual emotions? She asked herself. Too impatient to wait for him to wake up on his own, she narrowed her eyes at his nearly serene face. She kicked out her foot and struck his upper thigh with enough force to rock him, but not enough to cause bruises. He immediately sat up and looked around the room wildly, probably in search of the enemy. Luckily for Hinata, she had moved the chair far out of his reach. This is also why she decided to use her foot to nudge him instead of letting herself approach him closely enough to attack him. Naruto woke up bewildered because he couldn't recall giving in to his fatigue, much less lying in bed. He noticed Hinata sitting in a chair a few feet away as the confusion and sleep haze started to fade. Although he was unable to determine the cause of her irate expression, he sensed that something was wrong. His shoulder ached sharply, and the adrenaline from being startled awake quickly wore off. He looked down and recalled everything that had transpired the previous evening, but he was noticeably unremembering of what had happened once he had returned home. As he looked down, he felt everything inside of him come to a halt as he felt something gentle strike his chest and fall into his lap. He had been hit by Hinata's mask. Unsure of what to say, he raised his eyes to look at her without turning his head. Well, I see I have your attention now, she said in a soft, surprisingly serene tone. As she went on, her voice grew icy. So, Naruto, it's been a while. I would ask what you've been up to, but who doesn't know the exploits of Ronin, she said. Every micro-expression that passed by his face was examined by Hinata. She used to be able to tell what was going through his head just by looking at his face, but now she didn't know because she couldn't tell from the small snippets of expression what thoughts he kept so tightly concealed. How long have I been out? With a startled jerk, Hinata said, you've been unconscious for about 4 hours. He gave a simple nod, then rubbed his face and swung his legs over the edge of the bed. He dropped his hands and looked at her curiously. Was there something you needed? Hinata's mouth fell open as her jaw dropped. Are you seriously going to ignore this? She asked him, sitting up and glaring at him. He responded by sighing. Ignore what? I'm exhausted, wounded, and you're coming at me like some belligerent harpy. Honestly, Hyuga Haim, I don't know what time it is, but I haven't had nearly enough sleep to deal with whatever has your panties in a bunch." There was a loud crack that reverberated throughout the house for the second time that seemingly endless night. Takeshi emerged from the doorway, his face displaying a worried expression. He discovered a disbelieving Hinata glaring at Naruto from above. "Do not hit me again." Naruto's eyes narrowed, turning deathly cold. Hinata sat back slowly. That one sentence was enough to convey the implied threat clearly. This was not her Naruto. She pondered what might have happened to alter him so drastically. Is it worth her while to try to find the answers to her questions? After what felt like several minutes of unwavering staring at one another, Hinata let out a frustrated sigh and said, "Then explain this," pointing to the mask in a more composed manner. "I just want to understand." She nearly lowered her head to observe her hands clasped in her lap, but she resisted the urge to do so. "I've also changed. I'm no longer the bashful Hinata, and I'm not going to be her ever again." Hinata's eyes locked with Naruto's once more, almost daring him to answer. When he looked in the direction of the door, Hinata noticed Takeshi shrug and turn away. He glanced back at her for a moment, then got up from the bed and walked away. He turned back to her and took out his signature dark red shirt and pants from his bag. "There's nothing to explain, nothing for you to understand. Because the answers you are futilely seeking are pointless. My identity does not affect nor change the parameters of the job. I will protect you from the current threat, and that will be the end of it. You have your life and I have mine." Here he stopped and pointed to the distinctive clothes of the assassin Ronin. He gave her a calculating glance while crossing his arms over his chest and said, "I hope I can at least trust you to keep my identity secret. I'm sure you're aware of the ramifications of not doing so." Hinata laughed without humor. A laugh of surprise and rage. She raised her eyebrows. I apologize. I believed you were Naruto Uzumaki, but I see I was mistaken. I'll leave you to change, Ronin." As she got up to leave the room, she failed to notice Naruto's uncertain gaze fall to the ground. His mouth opened as though to speak, but he was at a loss for words as he looked up to stare at her backing away. "Should I apologize for being such a callous bastard? Should I push her away more, or should I give her another call?" Hinata left the room without realizing the man she had just left was having an internal conflict. Hinata returned to the sitting room where Takeshi was inspecting his pack's contents, including his weapons. She had no idea what to do and was furious about the state of affairs. She paced in the direction of the door leading to the backyard, pinching the bridge of her nose. To get Hinata's attention, Takeshi cleared his throat and said, "Sorry." He can be less than pleasant when wounded and running on so little sleep. Given what he had said, Hinata turned away from him and sneered at the man who was defending Naruto, saying, "Please, don't make excuses for his behavior. He is behaving as expected for one such as Ronin." How long had it been since he'd slept? She asked without turning to face him. Close to a week." Hinata turned around. "That's not possible. No one can go that long without sleep. A mental break would occur." Takeshi laughed at his own jab at his friend's mental toughness. "Yeah, well, he can. Besides, I wouldn't say a mental break hasn't occurred at some point," he said. When his attempt at humor failed, Hinata rolled her eyes and looked away once more. She saw that the sky was getting lighter as dawn drew near. Finally, "This night is over." Without waiting for an answer, she strode to her room and declared, "I'm going to get some rest." She didn't even notice Naruto walk into the hallway. Hinata dragged herself out of bed and thought, worst nap ever. Weariness from what she now called the longest night, she had collapsed onto the bed without taking off her clothes. That had been the extent of the pull of her fatigue. She had been lying in bed with a leaden body that would not move for more than 2 hours, but as her mind raced and rummaged through every stressful detail of the past few days, it seemed unable to give in to fatigue. She couldn't pinpoint the exact moment, but she was positive that her thoughts must have strayed into the unconscious at some point. Furthermore, even if it had not been long enough for her to feel rested. She thought her attempt to look less disheveled after a quick trip to the restroom was unsuccessful. Hinata went to get some water in the kitchen. After leaving her room, she didn't want to worry about Naruto, Takeshi, or anything else related to her current situation. She continued toward the kitchen after passing the sitting room and noticing the two men whispering close to the back door. Takeshi had been much more animated than Naruto, who had appeared to be his typical stoic self. Hinata found a light meal and some water quickly, and her ears had to strain to hear what those two were talking about. Her eyes had managed to pick up the mumbled words, crazy, pan, and lamp. During their whispered conversation, knowing that her sister, Hanabi, was the topic of their conversation, she shook her head and tried not to laugh out loud. Go, was the only other word she heard in a few seconds before she heard the sound of the back door opening and closing. She had a suspicion that she had been left alone with Takeshi instead of Naruto because her luck had not been good enough. When he came into the kitchen, her suspicions were confirmed. His blonde hair was falling forward in multiple spikes, forming a curtain over his dazzling blue eyes, and his mask was securely back in place. I should have burned that fucking mask. Cammy, she had spent hours sitting next to his bed, picturing just how she would throw his mask into the sitting room fireplace and joyfully light it on fire. She had even gone so far as to envision how he would be aroused by the smell of smoke and rush into the living room, since she honestly couldn't see herself being that bold or vindictive. Her fantasies always came to an end at that point naturally. I didn't see myself striking him once, much less twice, but you never know. Given how forthcoming he had been with answers lately, she thought it would be pointless to ask him where Takeshi went and how long he would be gone. She chose to stare him down with a blank expression on her face while leaning against the counter with a glass of water in hand rather than ignoring him by avoiding eye contact. Naruto had had an interesting couple of hours. He had to deal with his asshole antics and the problem of Hinata knowing who he was. It was necessary to send Gaara another clone. By the way, it's not a good idea to wake that guy up at dawn. He had told his friend everything he had discovered the previous evening after sending a second clone among other things. Members of Akatsuki were inside the village's boundaries. Naruto hoped the Akatsuki wouldn't care about the One-Tail's Jinchuriki because they were too busy tracking down his other identity and recruiting one of his. He inhaled deeply as he entered the kitchen and readied himself for the part he now had to play, not just in Hinata's life, but also in front of her for the next few days, anyway. After 6.5 hours, I'm going to murder him. Hinata was so exhausted and gasping for air that even her thoughts had to stop and catch their breath as she rested her back against a tree. That's what 6 hours of running does to a person. When Naruto first entered the kitchen, Hinata wasn't sure what to anticipate, but she most definitely wasn't prepared for him to declare that they were leaving the village as if the fabled tailed beasts themselves were pursuing them. He had given her a look that denigrated her intelligence before answering her question about why they were leaving. Should we wait here for your attackers to find us? When she realized he was right and that staying mobile was the best course of action, she bit her tongue. When they had sneaked out of the village and started their trek, she had attempted to ask him where they were going naturally. He had disregarded her every time she tried to speak. She had been furious at first, but she had calmed down after running through the trees behind him for an hour. She observed that they appeared to be retracing their steps at the end of the second hour. She had reassured herself that he might be doing this to confuse prospective followers. Over the course of the following 2 hours, her thoughts started to stray and she came to a conclusion. The 13-year-old Naruto she had known so well was clearly no longer the man in front of her. But did she think he was really that heartless killer Ronin? She fervently wanted to think that he couldn't have totally abandoned the innate qualities he had at 13. Those two personalities need to be balanced in some way. I simply cannot accept the idea that it can be either one. In light of those ideas, Hinata committed herself to striking a balance and bringing out at least a hint of the person Naruto might have developed into had he stayed in the village. In the back of her mind, she pondered whether she would achieve that equilibrium or become closer to Ronin. She had felt a physical attraction to him that defied logic before she found out who he was. She was now also emotionally attracted, but her feelings were agitated by his responses to her. She discovered that they had returned to the beginning of their journey after 4 hours of running. How on earth is he doing this? After stopping for a few minutes to drink some water, he resumed their journey in the same direction. Hinata contemplated stopping immediately until she received an explanation from him. However, a vague recollection of Sakura griping about Kakashi-sensei's peculiar combination of endurance training and tail shedding kept her going. She was unsure of the goal of this strategy. Was he attempting to train or confuse followers? I mean, how could he be training me? 2 more hours passed before they arrived at the spot where Naruto had started to turn around. They had been running back and forth for either east or west for the past 6 hours. Naruto now took a completely different route. Going north, he started to quicken the pace as well. Hinata had wished to stop or even slow down, if only a little, during their entire run because she didn't want to come across as weak in his eyes. She had declined both actions despite everything. I still give a damn about his opinion of me. Hinata thought she would pass out before they even got to their destination as he picked up the pace. The ease with which she had followed him impressed Naruto. It was beneficial that he was moving much more slowly than usual. In order to account for her years of insufficient training, she would likely grow even more resentful of him over the course of the next few trying days. But this was for her own benefit rather than being a liability. He needed her to be ready to defend herself when the time came. 30 minutes later, Hinata was struggling to breathe and avoiding a step that would send her crashing to the ground. Upon witnessing Naruto finally fall to the ground, she followed. Landing with less grace than he did, she instantly unzipped her sweat-soaked jacket and pressed her back against a tree. She wanted to remove it, but Naruto was too erratic. He'll leap into the trees and run the other way again, knowing how unlucky I am. Naruto turned to Hinata and shrugged off his pack. She looked adorable as she gasped for air and stared at daggers through his head, and he wanted to smile. He couldn't help but notice the top of her cleavage, which was exposed by her low tank top. As his eyes lowered, he recalled that, Despite the heat, she never took off or even unzipped her jacket. When they were teenagers, he turned away and looked around to make sure there were no other chakra signatures in the vicinity. Silently, "This'll do," he said. She was finally catching her breath and experiencing pain that she knew would worsen over the course of the next day. "Is this camp?" she asked, her eyes darting to Naruto. He started to move to the center of the clearing they had stopped close to, saying, "No, it's a makeshift training ground. Prepare yourselves. We get started in 5 minutes." "Training? For what?" Hinata asked, her eyes wide as she surveyed the clearing. He turned back to her and sighed wearily, saying, "I admit I've appreciated you not questioning me at every turn. Though I suppose that lack of inquisitiveness has left you at a disadvantage." He inhaled again before extending his hand to his neck and then abruptly releasing it. "I should have told you before we left the village. Your fiancé is behind these attacks on you. He's planning a large-scale one at the wedding." What Hinata had just heard shocked her. She was so shocked and confused by the news that she was unable to control it. All of the issues in her life right now were brought on by the same person that her family had selected, and that she had, reluctantly, accepted. Nezu was even responsible for this potentially regrettable reunion with Naruto. The thought of marrying that man made her shudder. So if Nezu is the one behind each attack, then why bother making attempts on my life before the wedding? He could have waited until after the ceremony when we were alone? She asked herself. She gave a little shudder. Naruto pretended that he didn't really care about the conversation. He might have been talking about something as uninteresting as the weather instead of murder attempts based on his appearance. He asked, "Easy answer." "Greed," he continued with a frustrated sigh when she continued to appear perplexed. He had emphasized the word, anything, leaving her unsure of what that might entail. The engagement contract states that if anything were to happen causing the wedding to be called off, your clan would have to pay him restitution. If his arranged attempts on your life were successful, he would gain the restitution as well as the bounty for your unsealed eyes. Now he's planning to attack at the wedding. He knows I'm guarding you and he's looking to cash in, big time. She was suddenly struck with the realization, he wants the bounty on you as well. Naruto nodded sharply in response, then turned to take off his coat and ninjutsu, setting them on top of his pack. He called out to her, "Are you ready to train yet?" "That's it. This reunion is definitely unfortunate," Hinata told herself. "Why'd I need to train? You know when he plans to attack and clearly you plan to be there." Once more, he gave her a look that conveyed his assessment of her intelligence. He chuckled a little at that, and she recalled that his favorite fighting technique used to be the excessive use of shadow clones. "Yes, I plan to be there, but I can't be everywhere. I'm only one guy." He lifted himself from his thoughts and continued, "You need to be ready for any eventuality. Your use of your family's gentle fist is predictable. Your skills as a shinobi are rusty and frankly, will do little to prevent them from getting a hold of you. Ergo, we're going to train here as much as possible over the next 3 days. Now are we done with the Q&A session?" After their long run, Hinata had finally caught her breath. She turned her back on Naruto and walked away from the tree, getting ready to shrug off her jacket. She felt a strong tug on the back of her jacket as soon as she had shrugged it off her shoulders, which caused her to fall onto her back. As she struggled to comprehend the impact, she became aware that her arms were trapped in her jacket. When she looked up, she saw Naruto beside her, pressing her down with his knee. Suddenly, a hard weight was placed across her chest. Naruto saw Hinata gaze up at him in shock, rage, and perhaps pain. "Oh my god, did I just do that?" He had never felt like such a callous jerk, but this was the only option. Hinata needed a crash course. Perhaps he wouldn't be so inclined to kiss and caress her if she started to despise him. During this training he became more determined to be ruthless as a result. With a disappointed expression, she saw him slowly reach out and tap her throat. "And now you're dead. Wah? Surely you haven't forgotten the cardinal rule to never lose sight of your opponent?" "We hadn't even started yet," she cried, growing more irate as she strained under his knee. He stood up without helping her. Removing his knee, he rolled his eyes and sneered at her, saying, "What, you expect someone to signal a start every time you're attacked? Get real, Heim?" With jerky movements, she stood up and took off her jacket. All the while glaring at him, she threw away her jacket without looking, and before she could assume a ready fighting stance, she was under attack from several quick strikes. As he leapt through the trees, he was careful to stay off the path to avoid raising suspicions among those who frequently traveled between the two well-known villages. He had no illusions about taking them by surprise, but as he sped past a small river that served as a natural landmark, he knew he should be getting closer. One of them was even hailed as a prodigy in his own right, making them some of the best shinobi the village had to offer. He knew they would detect his presence when he made contact, even though he was wearing seals to conceal his chakra. The party had been traveling for 12 hours after his meeting with Hiyashi, so he should be able to catch up to them soon. Although he hadn't been following them for long, They moved much more slowly than he did when he realized they had crossed the Kawano-kuni border. He had to admit to being a little taken aback when he thought about the path they would now have to take. Their achievement would make his trek with the young Hyuga even more challenging. How could I have allowed that blonde jerk to influence me to do this? He owes me a lot at the moment, an eye for an eye. Wouldn't I have been better off bringing a frying pan to throw at her? Yes, he thought smirkingly, a heavy cast iron one. He heard some voices coming from the path in the distance in an effort to determine whether or not these travelers were his target. The man slowed his pace to identify them. Neji-san, it is just not right that we should be sent away at a time like this when my sister is in constant danger, said a sobbing voice. The tall young man sighed, wearing a leaf forehead protector with pride. To be honest, he wished he could have remained too. He could have protected his cousin better, of course, but he also preferred her company to that of the younger person he was currently escorting. He had a close relationship with his younger cousin, but not to the same extent as he did with Hinata. Hanabi, on the other hand, had always maintained a distance when it came to family ties, whereas she had always treated him as a brother rather than a cousin or servant. It is what your father has decided, and we will do as he wishes. He is only concerned for your safety, Hanabi-sama, he stated clearly. Not letting the topic go, Hanabi joked, we could have stayed to help secure Hinata's safety, and we are all capable shinobi. Your father has hired Ronin to handle her safety, and if his reputation is anything to go by, then she should be in good hands. Neji said. The two other escorts in their small party sat up and listened intently when the name Ronin was mentioned. I do not trust him. He is a mercenary for hire and could just as easily turn on her for a quick Ryo, Hanabi said, sneering at her cousin. I may not be fond of them as well, but your father has placed his trust in Ronin and his companion, and I trust your father, he stated. That man knocked me out, and took me against my will, she practically screamed. She stopped in the middle of the path, determined to make her point against Ronin and his companion. I think he tried to grope me when he thought I was out. She became frustrated when she saw that her arguments were not getting her cousin to respond the way she wanted. The young man listened to the conversation while kneeling on a branch. He had a clear memory of the incident she had described in an attempt to save her life. He had to reposition his hold, and he had held her by the rear with a very firm grip. He ignored it because he believed she was unconscious. Now that she was discussing it, he could see the firm flesh moving beneath her baggy pants. Not that he would ever tell her, but he wouldn't mind feeling it again. He decided to stop thinking along those lines and jumped down behind her. He looked at her blandly and said, don't flatter yourself. I prefer women with curves, not little boys. At his insult, Hanabi whirled and started to splutter, unaware that he was Ronin's partner. Neji had moved into a fighting stance. The weirdo with the face paint and the blonde with the enormous fan hadn't seemed surprised that he had come. Takeshi observed. He addressed her cousin over the sputtering young Hyuga. Ronin sent me, I'm taking over. Neji straightened, and Hanabi's mouth fell open. Neji had never seen his face and needed her approval before he would give up his protector role. Hanabi, is this Ronin's partner? Neji asked. She contemplated lying to her cousin and accusing him of lying while she stared at the offensive ass in front of her. The ass shook his head slowly, his eyes taking on a hard glint, as if he had guessed what she was thinking. She decided to be honest, sighing in frustration and speaking in a sulky voice. Her tone was almost hopeful as she asked, if I say no, will you kill him? All it took to tell her cousin the truth was the look he was giving her. Yes, Neji-san, he is. Neji nodded and said, very well, what are your instructions? Having to follow orders from someone like this was annoying. But he told Hanabi that his uncle trusted these men, so he would follow his uncle's judgment. With a shrug, Takeshi said, I don't have instructions for you, but she, nodding toward Hanabi, is coming with me. Both Hyugas started to object to his statement. He just stood there and let the man's more dulcet tones and the female's screeching go in one ear and out the other, ignoring them. I don't give a damn what either of you think on it. Ronin says she isn't going to Konoha and I'm to take her elsewhere, so that is what's going to happen. Speaking to Neji, I would suggest you return to Suna, but stay hidden. Trust no one but your uncle. Returning to Hanabi. Now before we depart, I have a question for you. This may be the most important question you've ever had to answer. He waited to ensure she understood the gravity of the situation. What could he possibly be going to ask me? Hanabi wondered. Are you or are you not currently concealing a frying pan on your person? Wah, she exclaimed. Shocked by his question, she looked at him as if he had just grown a second head and asked, are you insane? Of course, I am. Do you think I could work with Ronin if I wasn't? He replied with a laugh. His expression changed from one blink of an eye to the next before settling back into one of serious determination. I'm not kidding. Do you have a frying pan hidden somewhere? If you don't answer me, I'll be forced to find out for myself. Then you'll probably accuse me of trying to grope you again, and I just don't have time for all that, so answer the question. This is ridiculous. Neji-san, clearly this man is a lunatic. Shrugging, Takeshi said, I've been called worse. She ignored her cousin, trying to persuade him to support her. Obviously, he can't be trusted with my safety. Neji had been a little taken aback by this man's engagement with his pampered cousin and, dare he say it, amused. He was now annoyed by her constant outbursts, though he raised his voice just enough to give it a sternness he didn't often use with her. Enough, Hanabi. You will cooperate with this man who is aiding in your safety. Hanabi couldn't believe these two were in agreement, and it left her stunned once more. These two men, who couldn't be more different from one another, were conspiring to put her in a situation that she didn't want to be in for a moment. She wondered if this was Hinata's attitude toward her upcoming wedding. For the time being, she would comply with their wishes. Fine, I said, turning to face the madman. Where are we going? That's for me to know, and for you to ask stupid questions about. Now let's get going, he said. Seriously, if you have a frying pan, I suggest you hand it over or there will be consequences. Hanabi asked. Where would I possibly hide a frying pan? As she stretched her arms out to her sides and rolled her eyes at him, she immediately regretted it when his gaze started to wander over her body in a way that she wasn't totally comfortable with. Very well, he replied in a rough voice, and without waiting for another word, he jumped into the branches of the closest tree. You coming, Heim? We don't have all day? He asked, glancing back as she kept standing there. She glared at Neji while pursed her lips, then leapt into the branches to follow the stranger. When Takeshi arrived, Tamari had looked at her brother. They detested not knowing about the plans their brother and Naruto were making. However, Kankuro gave her a brief nod, telling her to keep quiet in the background. They were ready to go back to Suna when Takeshi said, Ronin wanted him to pick up the young Hyuga. She saw how Neji's eyes followed them as they had driven off. Given the futility of his attempt, she assumed he was attempting to track them using Byakugan. Naruto had made that seal with the intention of preventing any ocular jutsu from detecting it. Neji turned to them and the few Hyuga who were traveling with them, his frustration visible on his face. I'm going back to Suna and I'm not waiting on any of you. There is more going on than we've been told. Obviously, she said abruptly. She looked around them and said, No, Hanabi Hyuga, no need for us. We're going back. We were told to escort Hanabi Hyuga. She gave Kankuro a nod, and they hurried off. They were unable to show any concern for the evolving situation. In addition, a feeling of dread told her to hurry back. Relieved that they had acted as he had anticipated by deciding to go back to their village now that their presence was no longer required, Neji watched them go. After making sure they left in silence with his Keke Genkai, he turned to his clansmen. Return to Suna, and tell Hiyashi-sama what has transpired. Make sure he is the only one present when you speak with him. If the threat is a traitor, all precautions must be taken. One of them said, What will you do, Neji-san? After they had all nodded. Gazing in the direction that Ronin's companion had led Hanabi, he said, I'm going to make sure my cousins are safe. They had spent the entire day traveling northwest, and Hanabi found it hard to keep up with their speed. As the sun started to set, she realized they were getting close to a mountain range, and she prayed to Kami that this crazy person wasn't going to cross it at night. They hadn't spoken. He was focused on his work, and she had made the decision to avoid him as much as possible. She clung to the slim hope that he was taking her to Hinata. If so, she would not be slinking off. Furthermore, it was obvious that he would just chase after her if she fled, and a fight would follow. It would make no difference if she prevailed in that battle because her energy would be further sapped, making her escape attempt more difficult. No, she would wait for the time being. He stopped in a narrow gorge just inside the mountain range. As he looked around, he said, We'll camp here at first light. We'll continue. She recalled hearing his name during their trip, right before he kidnapped her on purpose. She didn't use it. So crazy, man. Why are we crossing these mountains tomorrow? He took off his pack and looked inside. He grinned and said, To get to the other side, of course. Anticipating how annoyed she would be by his lack of clarity, he took pleasure in provoking her anger. He appeared to be quite skilled at it with little effort. Takeshi found a place to sleep and saw that she had done the same farther away. He was relieved that she had packed some food rations for herself and promptly took some out. He didn't want to risk giving away their location by starting a fire to cook if they were being followed. He was aware that offering to take first watch was the gentlemanly thing to do, but I've never said I'm a gentleman. Thus, he took a seat to rest and watch the performance. She was shocked to learn that he had simply collapsed and fainted. As a shinobi, you had to take turns on watch. It made it possible for everyone to sleep equally while protecting against assault. She was enraged, however, that he had not mentioned taking watch at all, nor had he offered to take the first watch as a gentleman ought to. With a devilish smile, she thought, I'll make him regret letting me watch first. Just waiting for her to express her disapproval, Takeshi had feigned sleep. He had anticipated that she would lose her temper or even try to attack him. It would be an understatement to say that he was taken aback when neither of those expectations materialized. It was a little challenging to see her sitting with her back to a rock after 20 minutes had passed because the sun had set. While they had eaten, she had activated her Kekkei Genkai and was observing her surroundings. After all, I suppose she won't bother me about this. The Byakugan hadn't even crossed my mind. He chastised himself in his mind for not counting all the tools at his disposal and then making the proper use of them. Takeshi was unable to fight the urge to sleep that pulled his eyelids down, but he didn't want to trust the little hellcat. Waiting for him to finally nod off, Hanabi had waited. Although it had been difficult to determine whether he was actually asleep, she had a gut feeling that she should wait. She got up quietly and started to walk over to his side of the bed. Takeshi woke up with a sharp pain in his stomach, and he instinctively swung out, jerking and catching a leg. He rolled to pin the attacker and put a kunai to their throat as they fell beside him. Upon realizing it was a female form beneath him, he was startled awake. As she fought to break free, Hanabi thought, that didn't go as planned. With the intention of tripping a little and further injuring him, she had stepped down hard on his lower abdomen. She would pretend to be sorry and apologize profusely when he woke up. As she paced the camp, she had intended to claim that her Byakugan had been activated and that she hadn't seen him because of the seal that had been placed on her. She had tried to defend herself after his first attack, which sent adrenaline racing through her body. However, he managed to pin both of her hands in one of his as he rolled on top of her. She thrashed beneath him as a result of this and the panic surge that followed. He took out the blade and put it away, saying, "Damn it, what the hell are you doing?" "Me? What the hell are you doing? Get off of me." Reminiscent of some of her first words to him following the explosion in the inn, he nearly burst out laughing. "Well, this seems familiar." She grew even angrier when she heard the humor in his voice. She moved to her side and raised her hips in an effort to push him away, but her actions had a different impact on him, one she didn't expect. He took a sharp breath, sensing the instantaneous response in his body. He refused to be attracted to her. He didn't want to be attracted. He was unable to refute the physical evidence, however. Takeshi jerked away from her right away and stood with his back to her, taking a moment to gather his thoughts. Uncertain of what had just transpired between them, Hanabi lay there in shock. She had been attempting to move him away from her, but she was taken aback when she made contact because of the sharp gasp he made and the sudden tightening of her stomach. She slowly got up, telling herself that was a bad idea. He took a few deep, soothing breaths and turned back to her. "Why'd you kick me?" Hanabi had almost forgotten how she was going to repay her for her first watch. She gave him the original justification she had intended to use, stuttering a little. "I started walking around, to stay awake, and didn't see you." Although he wasn't persuaded by her justification, he decided to overlook it for the time being. "Well, I'm awake, so I'll take watch, get some sleep." Hanabi nodded, perplexed by what had just happened, but she was suddenly worn out from the day of travel and the waning adrenaline. As she attempted to process the situation, she shuffled over to her pallet, occasionally glancing at him. She withdrew to her side of the camp, and Takeshi saw her show of caution with a sigh of relief. He let go of the breath he had been holding. The night was going to be long. The fact that Naruto had used the years to get him used to sleeping little made him feel grateful. It was 8 years ago. After Naruto had left, Jiraiya had sat for only a few minutes before making a choice that prompted him to take action. There had to be action. This was not how he wanted things to end. The lights were still on when he stopped in front of his destination after racing through the village, and he wondered what kind of mood she would be in. Would sake make her inebriated, or drunk on sake and furious at the bane of every Hokage's life, that terrible chore called paperwork? Would she be cheerful and well on her way to becoming drunk? Jiraiya chuckled a little about Tsunade's love of sake. She was never far from a bottle or from being intoxicated by it. Leaping up to the railing around her office, he sighed deeply before slipping through the open window. As expected, there was a bottle beside a large pile of papers on her desk. She asked, "What do you want, Baka?" Without raising her gaze from the paper she was holding, she gave him a quick glance when he completed the seals to ensure privacy in her office, feeling proud that her words had hardly slurred. His only answer was, "What happened?" as he appeared to fall heavily onto the windowsill's edge. Tsunade put down the paper, her expression betraying her bewilderment. "Many things happen in this village at any given second. You're going to have to be a bit more specific." "Naruto just came to see me at the inn, said he's leaving the village. I thought perhaps you'd know what could have caused it." "He said what?" Tsunade insisted, standing up suddenly and slamming her hands down hard on her desk, which caused the papers to move. She was aware that Naruto was not supposed to be out of the hospital, much less organizing a trip, and that he had not been given any missions to leave the village. He said, and I quote, "A person can only take being told there's something so many times before they start to believe it. Now we both know of the contempt he's suffered his whole life, but clearly something else has occurred to spur this reaction. She asked in apparent surprise. He's willing to give up on being Hokage and become a missing nin? The only answer she got was a dejected expression. I'll inquire with my Anbu. Surely one of them noticed something while patrolling the village. Knowledge of his departure cannot get out Tsunade. We cannot let him be labeled a missing nin. I will not fail him that way. What would you have me do, Jiraiya? Do you think he will come back? I do not know. I told him I would wait 5 days, perhaps a week before reporting him. With a resigned shake of her head, she said, and already you are breaking your word. I alluded to waiting that long to report him as a missing nin. I never said I wouldn't report that he went on vacation, he said, raising one finger to interrupt her thought process. When he winked after explaining his logic, Tsunade chuckled a little with a sigh. She said, so I see, and motioned to Jiraiya to lift the privacy seals so that she could start researching what had happened before Naruto left. Several members of Anbu were asked if they had seen any Naruto Uzumaki-related incidents. Jiraiya and Tsunade had not been able to piece together a picture of what had happened until a few hours later, as the sun was just starting to rise. Tsunade started summarizing the events as she threw one report after another from her Anbu onto her desk. So, before fully recovered from his injuries inflicted at the hands of one Sasuke Uchiha, Naruto checked himself out of the hospital. The gaki he went to speak with Sakura Haruno, who had strong, and rather insulting, words for him about his failure in upholding a promise. Naruto left her and was then approached by Homura Mitokado and Kaharu Utatane. Unfortunately, none of my Anbu could discern what those ancient bastards said to him. Tsunade collapsed as if she were boneless in her chair after dropping the last report onto her desk. Jiraiya was still sitting on the windowsill where he had been quiet for the past few hours. He looked at the fifth Hokage, and his eyes, which had been watching the approaching dawn, glinted hard. Then I think it's time we question both Sakura and her council, he said. Agreed, Anbu, Tsunade said, sitting up straighter and wearing a determined expression. A member of her elite team showed up, receiving his orders with a respectful bow. Jiraiya started to ask what they would do about Naruto as he was leaving, but he stopped when he heard a noise close to the door. Despite jerking around, neither Sannin saw anyone in the room when Tsunade rushed to her office door and jerked it open. She saw that the hallway was empty with a puzzled expression on her face. She shut the door and turned around, but the sound came again from her left. She hurried over to what looked to be her office wall and threw back a fist, ready to give their eavesdropper a very clear message. She was stopped by a childish, panicked voice that said, Oi, Baba, stop. When Tsunade's notorious rage erupted, she reached out and grasped a sizable piece of parchment that was designed to blend in with the wall rather than the wall of her office. Konohamaru Sarutobi was hiding behind that parchment. Old hag, be thankful you are the grandson of Hiruzen, she said, pulling the young boy into the center of her office while pinching his ear. How long have been here, you little gaki? Ow. Ow Baba, let go before you rip my ear off. I kind of need that, you know. As she readied herself to deliver a blow that would put the boy in his place, Tsunade's eyes widened. That thought came to a screeching halt when a soft hand touched her arm. As she turned, she saw a solemn Jiraiya standing next to her, pleading with her to let go of Konohamaru's ear. How long have been hiding there? He asked, crouching in front of the boy. Konohamaru's little face wrinkled up in defiance, and he pursed his lips. Long enough to know Ni-san was forced out of the village and all you two can do is sit around talking about it, he said, crossing his arms over his chest. Why you little gaki? Jiraiya interrupted Tsunade once more. I see. Why were you hiding in the Hokage's office? I was going to take her out so Ni-san could become Hokage boss. Was supposed to be next. Then it'd be my turn. The young boy sniffed contemptuously. The two adults gave the little boy a weary sigh. Konohamaru, Jiraiya went on. You do know that what you've heard here must remain a secret, for Naruto's sake, right? I know, he replied quietly. Are you really going to have him hunted as a missing nin? His eyes were filled with fear as he looked up at Jiraiya and Tsunade, fear for a boy he had grown to regard as his big brother. Tsunade made a statement, not if I have any say about it, and it just so happens as Hokage, I do. You're going to send someone after him, right? Konohamaru asked, his face brightening. The adults' expressions fell as they refused to instill a false sense of hope in the boy. I think it's best if we give Naruto some space for now. What, you're just going to let him go? I'll go after him myself if I have to. No one in this village cares about Ni-san, but I do. Tsunade's voice soared. Konohamaru, how dare you insult the legendary Sannin and Hokage of this village by accusing us of not caring for Naruto? Then why aren't you going to get him? There is more going on here than you are aware. It may be in Naruto's best interest to remain out of the village and hidden. Konohamaru's young, rebellious mind could not understand their reasoning. He muttered, "Fine," and stalked to the office door. "Before leaving you wait, I'll pursue him on my own as soon as I can." After they watched him leave the office, Jiraiya said, "We'll have to watch that one. He's too much like Naruto to let this go." "I know, I'll have Anbu watching him round the clock," Tsunade said with a nod. They both nodded as they got ready for Sakura Haruno and the elders to arrive for the upcoming interrogations. Now, though not always successful, Hinata dodged and blocked blow after blow. She felt innumerable bruises throbbing all over her body, her clothes were ripped, and she was covered in dirt for several hours. Naruto had been attacking her in every manner imaginable. She couldn't remember when she'd been flung to the ground or when his blows had struck her. He acted without hesitation and without mercy. Each move was painful, quick, and effective. They hurt. Even the ones she was able to block. The battle felt somewhat one-sided to her because she was unable to accurately pinpoint his tenketsu points due to the seal he wore to block the Byakugan against him. Hinata's primary defense was essentially ineffective. He had insisted that neither ninjutsu nor genjutsu were used in their battles, and he had even refused to use weapons. Hell, based on their sparring, he could have defeated her without any of those. She knew that he could have easily ended the fight hours ago, but he wasn't playing any tricks. As Hinata tried to catch her breath, Naruto stood motionless. He was filled with admiration for her. She had rarely complained after enduring every attack he had directed at her. Every time she let out a whimper of pain, he felt as if his heart were breaking slowly. Although he was determined to finish this, he was unable to fully withstand her anguish. While they were fighting, he had yelled commands and insults in an attempt to make her feel better. She moved in such a halting, practiced manner. She seemed to be attempting to recall a predetermined response for every attack he launched. Instead of merely letting her instincts take over, she suffered more harm as a result of this hesitation. He was certain that she was capable of beating him. She was overanalyzing everything, though. The renowned Hyuga logic must be the cause. Remain composed, unwavering, and use your intelligence against your adversary. Recalling something he had heard Neji Hyuga recite in the academy, he scoffed. Being more of a brawler, Naruto had always acted primarily out of emotion and instinct. However, he had developed the ability to quickly strategize during combat. Over the years, he had discovered that you needed to be able to modify your attack strategy according to every new opponent. As an assassin, it was his responsibility to enter and exit swiftly in order to make a silent kill, so his battles were infrequent. However, he still appeared to be more combat-ready than the Hyuga clan's heiress. Shortly after leaving the village, he had discovered that she was no longer a shinobi of Konoha. It made him wonder what might have caused that. She was someone he never thought would give up, and he recalled the resolve in her eyes when she had faced Neji during the Chunin exams. He struck her in the solar plexus with such force that she staggered backwards and then fell to her knees, gasping for air. "Let's take a break. I'm going to do a patrol. Make sure we're still alone." He became even more guilty of what he was going to do after noticing how she nodded her head without raising her gaze. Hinata listened as he backed off. She was grateful that he had taken a break, even though she wasn't sure what had finally caused him to do so. Even though the sun had already set, they continued to fight, and the darkness didn't seem to have affected his vision without his seals. Her eyes would have rendered the cloak of night useless. Instead, in an effort to protect herself, she had fought to see and hear him. She gasped for what felt like hours before finally catching her breath and struggling to get to her feet, determined to get to the water in her pack. Naruto didn't think it was necessary to clearly mark the beginning of a fight, so she was on high alert when she heard a twig snap, nor did she have any illusions that he would define the stop of a spar. Precisely, he appeared intent on making sure she was constantly alert, anticipating an assault every second. She was startled when she thought she saw her cousin's silhouette emerge from the trees. His usual stout manner was evident as he approached calmly. "What are you doing here?" "You're supposed to be escorting Hanabi back to the village," she whispered as she hurried over to him. As she got closer to Neji, she winced a little from some of the aches and pains that flared up. He appeared to be staring down his nose at her, and he arched an eyebrow. "If not for you, I wouldn't need to escort Hanabi back to the village. She'd be the one marrying Nezu and doing her duty as heir of the clan, rather than a weakling like you," he said without emotion. What? Neji ni-san," Hinata said, her eyes widening as she froze in place. "You don't deserve to be the heir of the clan. You're weak, always giving up and crying. I should end you right here and now so Hanabi-chan can prepare to lead the clan," he said, his face taking on a menacing expression as he approached her slowly. With unshed tears in her eyes, Hinata said, "Neji ni, you don't mean that? You can't truly feel that way?" "Oh, can't I? You should just give up now, fall to your knees and I'll make it quick. One strike to your heart should do it. This is your fate, something you have never been strong enough to change." There was a problem, And she shook her head in denial. She and Neji had a positive relationship that had grown over the years since the Chunin exams. She didn't understand why he would say these things to her, even though they were close confidants. She was so engrossed in her thoughts that she almost missed Neji's strike. She retreated quickly out of range, but she didn't want to hit him. "Neji, please just explain to me what has happened to make you say these things," she said, raising her hands in a conciliatory gesture. "What has happened?" "Nothing has happened, because you do nothing. You sit idly by, the little mouse, while everyone else defends you." "That's not true," she said in a horrified whisper in an attempt to combat the emotional pain she experienced after hearing her cousin's insults. She put one arm around her waist and clutched the other close to her chest. A sharp pain in her back jerked her in Neji's direction. As he got ready to attack, she spun around and positioned herself behind her cousin, crouching slightly and ducking under his arm to put some distance between them. She shoved him forward with the palm of her right hand after Hanabi had hit Hinata in the back. Hinata hadn't anticipated pushing him directly in her direction. She screamed in her head, "What the hell is going on?" "It is true. Nei-san, you are a flaw to the otherwise perfect Hyuga clan, one we intend to fix now." When her cousin and younger sister assumed the all-too-familiar fighting positions, Hinata was genuinely taken aback. Tears were streaming down her face as she persisted in trying to dissuade them from attacking her. She paused long enough to take a blow to her previously injured shoulder, which sent her reeling backwards as they launched simultaneous attacks. "They're my family, so I can't fight them," she thought angrily. As best she could, she fought to deflect or avoid their blows. She still couldn't believe it was happening, to be honest, but the pain from their attempted strikes convinced her that it was a wise move. She repeatedly identified points of attack, and each time she paused long enough to take another blow. She simply could not bear to hurt one of them. "Please, stop this," she gasped as she finally managed to get some distance between them. "Oh, looking to give up already, Hinata-chan?" As she turned, she saw Kiba emerge from the trees. The relief that ignited in her chest upon seeing her old teammate was too obvious to conceal. Hinata sprinted in his direction without even questioning his appearance. "Kiba-kun, I don't know what's wrong with Neji and Hanabi, but we have to help them." "I am here to help them, Hyuga-heim," Kiba said with a savage smile. His clawed hand slashed out, tearing strips from her tank top over her stomach. Hinata shook her head and skidded to a stop. "It must be some sort of nightmare. Naruto must have caused me to faint from exhaustion." Anger flashed in her eyes and she snapped her head up. "What did you just call me, Kiba?" With a faint smirk, he said, "I called you the spoiled little weakling you are." Hinata could hear Neji and Hanabi coming, but she decided to ignore them as her resolve grew stronger and her spine stiffened. As soon as she realized there was nobody in the clearing, she quickly activated her Baikugan. A savage smile appeared on her face and she shook her head, letting go of her Kekkei Genkai. She struck Kiba with a kill strike, saying, "You made a mistake, Naruto," and felt a sense of accomplishment when he vanished in a cloud of smoke. With a snap, she dragged Neji to the ground after spinning on the ball of her foot and lifting her opposite one to wrap her lower leg around his neck. He disappeared, too, and she stood. She walked up to the picture of her younger sister, blowing a stray hair out of her eyes. Keeping her chin up, Hanabi said, "They were weak, just like you, but I'm not just give up, Hinata, it's what you've already done." "Shut it. What are you trying to accomplish here, Naruto?" said Hinata, who had had enough of Naruto's training. She noticed him standing behind Hanabi at that moment. After creating shadow clones, Naruto applied henge to them to create pictures of the people he believed were most important to her. She had been appalled by their attack on her, and he had seen her cry out in denial of their charges, "I am a real bastard." "You are weak, Hinata. The sooner you realize that, the sooner you can overcome it," his words rang out. "Besides, I needed to be sure you weren't going to give up as you're prone to do." "What are you talking about?" Naruto rushed forward, his anger radiating from him, and the shadow clone of Hanabi vanished. "You gave up? What part of that isn't clear? You nearly gave up in your battle against Neji during the exams. You clearly gave up on being a kunoichi. If you hadn't, I wouldn't need to waste time trying to get you back up to par." When he was only a few inches from her, he stopped. She was initially ready to make a denial and emphasize that she hadn't given up during that battle, but his subsequent statement left her stunned. She frantically searched for a point to make, a counter-argument that would force him to halt this savage verbal assault. "You have no idea what you're talking about. You're right, Haim. I have no idea how someone with as much potential as you could so easily turn her back on her Nindo." He grumbled with a disgusted shake of his head. He brushed past her and headed for his pack. Hinata's reaction was instinctual. Her actions were motivated by anger, betrayal, and hurt. She put her foot near his and pulled, flinging her hip against him. As she reached out to grab his shirt collar, she gained the necessary momentum to toss him to his back a few feet away from her. After the combination knocked him off balance, He rolled to his feet with ease, so the move didn't take him by surprise for long. "It's about time you lashed out without stopping to think it through," he growled. She stopped when she realized that everything had been a ruse to get the exact response she had shown. His cruelty and her family's insults were all intended to help her break free from their deeply rooted way of life. He maintained his posture. "You get it now, don't you? Why do you think you had so much difficulty fighting in your family's style? Why you were always perceived as the weaker family member? It doesn't suit you, it isn't your natural style of fighting. That doesn't matter. You had no right doing what you did, or accusing me of turning my back on my nindo, especially when you," she continued. "When I what?" he asked, his eyes narrowing. "When you gave up on yours first. You gave up on the village and your friends. You just disappeared. No one knew where you were or if you died. How could you do that?" she yelled, determined to give it to him as best she could. Naruto's voice became rough and growly as he spoke, and his fingers curled as his nails slightly grew longer. "First of all, that village turned its back on me the day I was born. My so-called friends were a team of assholes with their heads stuck too far up their asses to see the light of day." Hinata froze at the intensity, the unwavering belief he was able to convey in his words that he really had no one in his life who would support him. She had never stood by his side, preferring to observe from the shadows because she was too terrified of being negatively assessed by someone she held in such high regard. No, you have no idea what you're talking about. Let me tell you this. I had more attempts on my life during the 13 years I spent in Konoha than I've had as Ronin. So instead of standing your ground you gave up?" Hinata asked, with a heavy sigh, as she looked at him tearfully. "Perhaps you're right and I don't know what I'm talking about, but neither do you. Don't presume to judge me by the basic facts you've learned. You don't know everything about me and I don't know everything about you. I think it's time we called it a night, don't you?" she said, looking thoughtfully at him. She hardly heard his hushed words as she turned to leave for her pack, hoping to get cleaned up and get some much-needed sleep. "Good night, Hinata." Turning back to him, she found the courage to confess something she should have said years ago because she couldn't just leave things as they were. "Naruto, I always thought we were friends," she said with a self-deprecating shrug and a lack of humor. "Maybe I was wrong." As he watched her leave, Naruto realized he ought to correct her erroneous assumption. There was too much miscommunication between them when he was in the village. He had assumed they were friends, but now he realized they both felt the same way about each other. However, he failed to see why Hinata Hyuga would ever wish to be friends with the demon brat. "No, it's better this way," he told himself. "We'll survive the next few days and then resume our lives, so there's no chance that we'll get too close." An hour later, even though Hinata was physically exhausted from tossing and turning on her pallet, she was unable to fall asleep because of her emotional and mental turmoil. She sighed deeply, sat up, and gathered her blanket around her shoulders before making her way to the center of the clearing. She used to enjoy going to the training ground well before dawn to simply gaze at the stars. When she was younger, she prayed to Kami that she would feel more at ease if she did this now. She wished she could sit there under a full moon as she looked at the stars while the half moon hung low in the sky. She was aware that it would be a stunning sight. When Hinata felt Naruto behind her, she let out a long sigh. "If I asked you a straightforward question, do you think you could for once give a straightforward answer?" She had walked to the center of the clearing and sat there staring at Naruto. It brought back memories of the time he had, out of concern for her welfare, asked her if he could go with her to the training ground, but she had never asked. Even though Naruto had assumed she simply didn't like him, he had gotten up early every morning to keep an eye on the Hyuga compound in case she chose to go back to the training ground. The number of times he had kept watch over her from the tree line had slipped his mind. He had discussed ways to prevent ocular jutsus with Ero Sennin and Kakashi Sensei because he didn't want to be seen again. They thought he was motivated to get ready for a fight with Itachi or Sasuke. They would never suspect that he was spying on the girl. If Ero Sennin had known the true reason, he probably would have been more willing to assist. As it was, they had only provided him with information about simple seals that did not meet his needs. Developing several seals required hours of studying those scrolls. He would then test them on other Hyugas to see if their Byakugan could identify him. He thought of all the tricks he had played on different Hyuga clan members in an attempt to perfect the seal. "Don't pretend not to hear me, I know you're there." Her voice brought him back to reality. It would depend upon the question. "Why did you leave the village?" she asked with a small nod. Naruto sighed. He didn't want to talk about it ever again. However, he thought that maybe he could go back in time to the events that led up to his departure with this woman. In the dark of the night, he sat down beside her and gazed at the stars as if he could find answers in them. "Do you remember when I failed to bring Sasuke back?" he asked, his voice trailing off a little. "When I returned from the Valley of the End?" "Yes, of course." After nodding, Naruto went on in a tone that seemed detached, as if he were reciting a list of things that had happened to someone else rather than to himself. Sakura came to the hospital probably to see Sasuke, but she entered my hospital room with Tsunade while Shikamaru was visiting. I had made a promise to her that I would bring Sasuke back. On my life, when I tried to apologize, she kept changing the subject, acting like everything was fine. After a couple of minutes of that, she said it was okay. As she listened, Hinata reflected on how much Sakura had meant to Naruto, so much so that he would risk his life to make such a promise to her. The corner of his mouth lifted slightly as he said, I was always leaving the hospital before I was supposed to. I found her at Training Ground 7, and I thought everything was fine, but I was wrong. Hinata's face wrinkled in bewilderment. She had long since given up observing the stars in favor of closely examining Naruto's face under the half-moon's light. What do you mean? The scene at the hospital had been just that, a scene, an act she put on in front of Tsunade and Shikamaru. I found out how she really felt right there at our training ground. She said I was a useless baka, and that I'd failed to uphold my promise. I couldn't even fail the promise correctly, since I didn't die. I'd never seen such hatred in her eyes. I felt as though she just struck a death blow, Naruto said, turning his emotionless, icy gaze on Hinata. The things she said weren't too important, it was how she said them. Unable to believe that someone could say such things to Naruto, especially after he had put his life in danger, Hinata gasped and put her hands to her mouth while shaking her head. The funny thing was, even after she lashed out at me, I was still determined to keep that damn promise. I headed back to Hokage Tower. I was intent on getting Tsunade to send me back out for Sasuke immediately. When he fell silent, she gently prodded him on, even though she was afraid to ask what happened next. Then what? With such contempt, he uttered the word, council. I was stopped before I could even enter the tower by her council. They called me names, said I was to be removed from the village dead or alive, if I remained till dawn, that it was my fault the last Uchiha was gone. They had Anbu with them. Anbu with blank white masks that stopped me when I tried to rush past them to get to Tsunade. They told me this was on her orders. I have to say, with those Anbu backing them up, it was all pretty convincing. Unshed tears filled Hinata's eyes. She was aware that Naruto had endured cruel treatment while in the academy. However, she was unaware that people were still treating him so cruelly. So I left the village that night, found a way to survive, and here we are. I apologize if you have more questions, Hinata, but I'm done answering them. As he got up to leave, she couldn't help but notice the sagging of his shoulders. She also couldn't find the voice to return his call. Regardless of what he has told me, there must be more to it. Hold on. White, blank masks. In the meantime, after hours of tracking, he was unable to locate them up ahead or even determine their route using his Kekkei Genkei. He had been forced to rely on his meager tracking abilities and guess the general direction on several occasions. Neji thought he should just turn around because he was going in the wrong direction. One of his cousins was out here somewhere, and he would fulfill his duty to keep her safe. He had wanted to kick himself for thinking such things. He eventually found the gorge where they had made camp after he had trudged on naturally. He had only heard Hanabi's irate voice a few hours after sundown and knew they were here. He shook his head regretfully and chuckled to himself. I never thought I'd be so thankful for that temper of hers. Now that he was certain of their location, he had made the decision to stay away. Neji had faith that Ronin's companion wouldn't force Hanabi to hike through the mountains at night, endangering her. All he could hope was that she was shielded from the chilly weather. Facing the direction from which he had heard Hanabi's voice, he leaned his back against the mountainside. He was only going to take short breaks and keep his own watch. It would be an understatement to say that he was taken aback when the man he was pursuing woke him up an hour later. I thought I told you to go back to Suna? The dark outline of the man sitting on a nearby rock was just barely visible to Neji's eyes. He chose to remain in his current location and act casually during this unusual meeting. I don't recall being told to follow any orders from you. I understand it is yours and Ronin's job to protect my cousins, so it is in their best interest to do as you suggest. I, however, am under no such obligation. Are you trying to get yourself killed? Are you threatening me? The man cracked a grin. No, but you'd be wise to listen to the suggestion of a concerned individual. Ronin and I have this under control. Yes, it sounded that way an hour ago when Hanabi was yelling at you. Your cousin was just expressing her opinion on who should take first watch. It's nothing to concern yourself over, Neji said, hearing someone clear their throat. Of course not. How did you manage to render yourself invisible to the Byakugan? Neji said, his furrowed brow invisible in the darkness of the night. Did he smile at me because he thought he saw a flash of white? I'm afraid that's a trade secret. If you insist on following us, you can take watch. Then he vanished. Half an hour later as Hanabi continued to shiver uncontrollably, she thought, it's freezing. She was aware that the gorge where they had set up camp would get cold, but she hadn't anticipated such a sharp decline. She huddled in on herself, trying to retain and harvest some semblance of body heat, but it felt like every fiber in her body was freezing. It can't be just me who's cold. She cocked her head in an attempt to locate Takeshi. She saw him curled up beside a stack of rocks over there. He's safe from the wind, hold on. Why is he sleeping? He is expected to be on guard. As she collected the blankets that comprised her pallet and cautiously approached the spot where Takeshi was sleeping soundly, every muscle in her body moaned in protest. For a few minutes, Hanabi stood above him, debating in her head whether or not to carry out her thought. The decision was made when a powerful wind blew across her shoulders, chilling them as it passed over the top of the boulder. She quickly placed her pallet on the floor beside him and wrapped the blanket around herself. She was cautious to maintain a minimum of 18 inches between them. She only needed the boulder's protection from the icy winds, not the warmth of his body. After 4 hours, she decided that moving was just not an option because she was warm, almost too warm, and it was so pleasant. A constant lulling sound was so hypnotic that she could feel her subconscious pulling her back to sleep until her pillow started to tremble a little. She inhaled deeply and became aware of how her upper body touched a warm surface, and the soft laughter replaced the lulling sound. Laughter? Just couldn't stay away, could you, beautiful? In a silent prayer that this was all some horrible nightmare, Hanabi squeezed her eyes shut more tightly. She realized with horror that she was lying on the chest of that disgusting little worm, Takeshi, and she heard more laughter. Her head shook. With laughter in his eyes, he followed her as she scurried away from him. The mortifying embarrassment on her face made him laugh a little harder. Oh baby, are you playing hard to get? After scoffing and gathering her blankets, Hanabi stormed over to her pack, her eyes shooting daggers at him. Takeshi gave another little laugh. A half hour before, he had woken up to the reassuring feel of a warm, soft body nestled against him as he lay there. He had relished the feeling and been mesmerized by her face's relaxed state of sleep. He had been mesmerized by her since she wasn't hurling insults, snide remarks, or kitchenware at him. He noticed the tingling in the arm she had rested on and the stiffness in his back from lying in one position for too long. As he started to sit up, he made the decision to return her to her habit of insulting him. Geez, female. How much do you weigh? I've got no feeling in this arm thanks to you laying on it all night. As he watched her spine stiffen as she refolded her blankets into her pack, he could actually see her bristling with rage. Even an unmannered idiot, such as yourself, has heard you never question a lady about her weight. That's true, he said with a contemplative nod, but then you're not a lady, you're a spoiled lil gawky. He gave her a wink before putting away his own set of blankets after she turned to glare at him indignantly. With a sly smile of revenge, Takeshi looked in the direction they had come from. Hanabi looked at him curiously, and she rolled her eyes when he shook his head, ignoring her unasked question. He picked up his pack and turned to face the sky, estimating that it would be at least an hour before the gorge was illuminated by the first rays of dawn, enough time to get out of here and leave Neji Hyuga far behind. He hoped the man liked the brief diversion he had given him, hinting that he had a call of nature to make. He urged Hanabi to continue, to which she had looked disgusted and then moved ahead of him. Using his fingers, he created the seals he needed, leaving behind what he hoped would prevent Neji from coming too soon. Just before dawn, Neji awoke and quietly repacked his belongings while keeping an ear out for any movement from Ronan's partner and Hanabi. I should really find out his name, he thought. He chose to get a little closer to their camp after listening for the others to wake up for 15 minutes in silence. Hanabi's voice had reverberated far and wide, and he was shocked to discover how far he had come from their camp. Neji had set up camp at the gorge's mouth, and he discovered the other two, still asleep, right in the middle. He did not like seeing them sleeping. His cousin was cradled against Ronan's partner in what might have passed for a lover's embrace. He kept reminding himself, from his vantage point on a boulder 15 feet away, that it's none of my business. He couldn't help but feel disapproving of what he was seeing and protective in a brotherly way. He kept staring up at the sky, wondering why they were still asleep. Ronan's partner couldn't possibly be lazy about getting to his destination, could he? He heard the sleeping couple move at that moment, and when he looked over, he was furious. While freely touching his cousin, the man claimed to have heard Hanabi groan, Takeshi. That was it. He was unable to watch or listen to this continue. He hurried over, grabbing Takeshi by the collar of his shirt, but as he and Hanabi vanished in a whirl of leaves, he noticed a smirk on the man's face. When Neji froze, he quickly looked around with fresh eyes and saw the tracks that made it obvious that his cousin and Takeshi had been gone for more than an hour. The male Hyuga hurried off in the direction of the mountain range, and if anyone had been in earshot, they would have heard what sounded like a growl. He was furious that a genius like him could have been so easily duped. He pondered absently whether his clansmen had returned to Suna without incident. As he sat in his suite, Hiyashi Hyuga reflected on the previous 24 hours, the frequent barrage of inquiries and charges from Hinata's fiancé, as well as the encounters with the Kazekage and the Hyuga elders. It felt like an endless circus of arguments, excuses, and platitudes. He seemed to be the only sane person in the group, so the case cage was the only one he didn't mind talking to. Reflecting on what he had learned from the clansman who had been tasked with escorting Hanabi to Konoha, he shook his head regretfully. It was not the best news to hear that Ronen's partner had left with her, that Neji was pursuing them, and that, to put it mildly, nobody could be trusted. The little rat was determined to find Hinata, and Hiyashi wasn't sure how long he could keep Nezu at bay. It was insulting that he had charged Hiyashi with fabricating a complex ruse to evade a personal examination of Hinata, but he was willing to do anything to ensure his daughter's safety. He suspected Nezu's true intentions and was by no means stupid, but he was unable to act on his suspicions in the absence of any concrete proof, since he was the one who initially proposed that Ronen be sent after Hinata. Hiyashi intended to discuss Ronen with Kazekage Gaara. He would undoubtedly have some knowledge that could allay his fatherly worries about his two daughters' safety. He would start a covert investigation in the interim to determine which of his daughters would be genuinely trustworthy. I'm telling you, Gaara, something doesn't feel right about all of this. This situation is getting too complicated. We should keep our distance from the Hyugas and Ronen. This won't end well for anyone, and now the Akatsuki are within the village walls. We should secure you while we search the village. Don't be hasty, Tamari. According to Ronen, the Akatsuki are here for him and Naruto. We will prepare for any eventuality, but we will not tuck tail and hide when my friend may need me most. But Odato-san, she said, but her words were cut off by her younger brother's stern expression. With her chin up and her lips pursed, Tamari stalked out of the room. She's only concerned for your safety. She wishes you would put your own well-being above Naruto's for once, said Kankuro, who was standing to the right of Gaara's desk, the Kazecage's right hand. Kankuro, if not for him I wouldn't be here, and you know it. He is my first and only true friend. I will not abandon him when things seem so uncertain. He would do the same for me. Kankuro only needed to respond with a silent nod. He was aware of and appreciative of his brother's romance with Ronen. Gaara was not going to change her mind. As she fell asleep, he listened to the sound of her breathing. While he lay awake, his mind refused to comply with his body's pleas for rest. Even though fatigue had long become a familiar state for him, his training session with Hinata and the moonlit conversation were replayed over and over, making it impossible to fall asleep. He had been pleased with her handling of the situation during the training. She had apparently absorbed all of his instructions, and there were few, if any, complaints. However, it was evident that as the evening went on, her anger toward him grew. Naruto acknowledged that he regretted the slight he had given her by using Kiba and her family's shadow clones. He also had to acknowledge, if only to himself, that he had enjoyed her rage when she had finally defended herself, the gleam of fire in her eyes, the effective manner in which she had at last dealt with the threat. It had stoked his foolish, burning desire to have her and to hear his name come out of her breathy groans. Ever since he had saved her the first time, the fire of that desire had been simmering gently. Fortunately, he had outgrown his impetuous behavior from his youth, which had been compelled by trial and error. Without the ability to maintain composure and patience, one could not be a half-decent assassin otherwise. Instead of continually pricking her pride in an attempt to make her despise him, he would have long ago given in to those desires, because he would have undoubtedly given in to that old impulsiveness that gnawed at him if she had even the smallest sign of concern or a spark of attraction for him. However, she had questioned him about that evening 8 years prior instead of the scorn or condemnation he had expected, something he was all too familiar with. He saw genuine concern for him. Something inside of him had screamed for her even louder at that moment, but he restrained himself. Feeling that way, especially in relation to Hinata Hyuga, was not appropriate at this time. Now he turned over on his side and watched her for another hour, breathing, sleeping, and waking up every now and then. She captivated him even while she slept, and there was something captivating about her. Her long, dark night hair was coiled above her head, revealing her delicate neck's sensitive flesh. There was nothing he wanted more than to lie next to her and kiss that skin. The thought of actually doing that kept tormenting him until he turned away from her in a frustrated groan, slipping into a meditative state that would allow him a small amount of necessary rest. He forced his mind to blank, a challenging task. Hinata let out a frustrated sigh because Naruto had set a demanding training schedule for her as soon as she woke up compared to what she had been trained in before. She had to admit that everything he taught her felt more natural to her. Instead of totally ignoring her family's distinctive style, Naruto had figured out how to use it without becoming overly dependent on it. He had said, "The Hyuga style has its usefulness, but I want you capable of recognizing and adapting to when it isn't." She had been enduring everything he threw at her for hours because she couldn't argue with his reasoning. Avoiding a backhand, she experienced a slight ache in her hip, a bruise from earlier in the morning when she had been preoccupied with memories of the night before. Her thoughts continued to race through the different possible reasons for what had happened to him. She was aware that the blank white masks were never worn by Tsunade's Anbu. Danzo had trained his own Anbu force with the goal of capturing Konoha, as had been made public several years prior. Kaharu and Homura had denied any involvement in Danzo's scheme. However, it would have been obvious that the Anbu members who had ejected Naruto from the village were lying. If they had been root members, the Hokage needed to be informed of this information. Hinata followed this line of reasoning until she discovered that Lady Tsunade had never formally designated Naruto as a missing nin. She had actually pretended that there was nothing noteworthy about his disappearance. Since he was clearly missing and no death had been announced or a solo mission mentioned, everyone had just started calling him a missing nin. As a missing nin, she questioned whether he was actually wanted. Since the Hokage had always been fond of Naruto, it would not be impossible for her to decline to designate him as such. Would he ever be able to get back to the village? Not if he doesn't want to, and who could blame him if he didn't? She sneered at herself. Pain shot up from the side of her head, just above her left ear, and her thoughts screeched to a stop. She let out a cry of agony and staggered a little before looking up to see an unrepentant expression in his eyes. "Pay attention, I was," she said, gritting her teeth in annoyance and pain. "Don't bullshit me, Hinata. I can tell when you aren't paying attention." She straightened up and said, "Oh, how is that, too? Since you are so familiar with me." Her tone was tinged with sarcasm. "Because I'm observant, something you've failed to be twice today." She knew that if she turned away from him, he would only emphasize how important it was to pay attention, so she never did. "Maybe it's because I've hardly had any sleep. I'm hungry and dehydrated." "Those are justifications. Do you believe your opponent will be concerned about your poor diet or lack of sleep?" She halted her retreat to fully confront him. "To be honest, I don't, but I do, and I think I'll take a break since I feel like you're not really trying to kill me." Hinata waited for his response, but he always had a counter-argument to anything she said. Suddenly, he appeared to be the one who was preoccupied. She shrugged and went on toward her pack, where food and water were waiting, but was interrupted by a rough hand on her forearm. Instinctively, she struck out, as he had been training her to do, but he also caught her opposite arm. She experienced a wave of bewilderment, rage, and anxiety as Naruto pushed her back to a tree, and inexplicable emotions swirled in his eyes as she looked into them. As his head slowly lowered towards hers and he released one of her arms to take her jaw in his hand, he kept his gaze fixed on her eyes. His eyes seemed to dart from her eyes to her lips and back again. As he took a step toward her, he let go of her other arm and reached up to lower his mask, letting her eyes fall to his lips. "Is he going to kiss me, Kami?" Zetsu had only been spying on the Hyuga heiress and Ronin for a few minutes, long enough to notice that the female was preoccupied and the two were sparring. He had to admit that the sight in front of him caught him off guard. After arguing, the two appeared to suddenly find themselves in a close embrace despite having his back to him. Zetsu saw when Ronin slipped his mask down his face, and he longed to approach to satisfy his curiosity about who the man was. He had been instructed to observe rather than approach, so he could not risk being discovered.
So that's it for today. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Don't forget to like, share and subscribe to the channel for more awesome stories like this. Thank you. See you all in my next video.